She was 20 and unclaimed. No bedroom, no legal address, no one waiting up for her, just a canvas backpack and $17.42 she had earned mending torn hymnals in a church basement. And with that money, she bought a water-powered paper mill for $1 beside Cold River Road in Alstead, Cheshire County, New Hampshire, in a forgotten village that fell off most maps by 1934. The wheel had frozen in its black wooden cradle. The roof sagged where 3 winters had pressed it down. The county said the building had been closed since 1968 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the iron throat of the Hollander beater, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 90 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Maren Vale had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had waited first in rented rooms, in houses where nothing belonged to her except the lower drawer of a maple dresser and the narrow shelf above a radiator. She had waited beside kitchen tables while grown voices moved behind closed doors, not shouting, but cutting in that careful, exact way adults use when they are trying to keep a child from hearing the shape of ruin. She had waited at the window for her mother's car to come back from late shifts, counting the sweep of headlights over the snow, one by one, until the road became only darkness again. In those early years, Ivy was the kind of child who kept things because things seemed more faithful than people. A milkweed pod with the silk still tucked inside. A blue button found near the laundromat dryers. A strip of wallpaper peeled from a room they had left in Brattleboro, pale yellow with little green vines crawling over it. She pressed each treasure flat in a notebook and wrote beneath it in her careful school hand, not the story exactly, but the weather of the day, the room, the smell, the sound underfoot. Her backpack began as a school bag from a charity bin, navy blue canvas gone gray at the corners, with a zipper that caught unless she pulled it slowly with both hands. By 12, she carried 3 notebooks in it. By 16, 6. By 20, there were 8, wrapped in an oilcloth pouch, each one swollen with clippings, pencil sketches, glue marks, and scraps of paper she had rescued from trash cans behind bookstores. She carried them against her ribs the way some people carry photographs. Her mother, Lorna, had once been soft in a way that made rooms quieter. She was a practical woman with hair the color of dry wheat and hands that smelled of dish soap, paper money, and the coconut lotion she used when winter split her knuckles. When Ivy was little, Lorna hummed while paying bills, as if melody could make numbers more obedient. She stitched buttons back onto coats with thread saved from torn hems. She made soup from bones and onions and would stand at the stove with her hip against the counter, tasting from a wooden spoon, staring at nothing for a long time. There had been no father at the table. Ivy's father was spoken of only in weathered pieces, like an outbuilding seen from the road through rain. He had been a printer's assistant. He had loved old books. He had left before Ivy could form the word for him, though whether by cowardice, illness, or ordinary human failure, Lorna never said. The absence did not have a face. It had a chair. It had a winter coat that was never bought. It had the strange politeness of teachers who paused when they reached the line marked Father's name. But Ivy did have Elias Reed. He was not her grandfather by blood in any simple way, but a great-uncle on her mother's side, the older brother of Lorna's mother, and in the map of Ivy's heart he occupied the place of a steady northern star. Elias lived in a white clapboard house outside Walpole, New Hampshire, where the Connecticut River bent through fields and the air smelled of wet leaves, wood smoke, and the sweet mineral damp of cellars. His house leaned a little east, as if listening. He had been a bookbinder once, then a restorer, then, as he aged, simply a man people brought ruined paper to. Water-stained family Bibles, ledgers chewed by silverfish, letters folded so many times the creases had become wounds. His workshop stood behind the kitchen in a converted porch with 6 tall windows, each pane wavy enough to make the maples outside look as though they were under water. There were presses on the bench, awls in a rack, rolls of linen thread, bone folders polished by years of thumbs, and shallow trays where wet sheets lay between felts beneath clean boards. Every other Saturday, when Lorna could afford the gasoline or when Elias sent for them himself, Ivy spent the day there. The ritual never changed. She arrived before 9, took off her shoes by the back door, washed her hands in the deep porcelain sink, and waited for Elias to inspect her fingers. "Paper remembers oil," he would say. Then he handed her a cotton apron, too wide at the waist, and the work began. He taught her how to lift a page without frightening it. That was how he phrased it. Not tearing, not bending, not damaging, frightening. He showed her how to humidify brittle paper in a covered chamber with a damp blotter below a screen, never touching the water. He taught her wheat starch paste, cooked low and slow until it lost its cloudy look and turned glassy at the edge of the spoon. He made her test every batch between finger and thumb, feeling for grit, thinning it with drops rather than guesses. On warm weekends, when the lilacs were open and bees moved heavily in the blossoms, he took her out to the shed where he kept a compact vat, a decal and mold, a worn press, and stacks of cotton rags sorted by color. There she learned the older work, the wet, patient labor before books became books. Torn linen soaked in a barrel, pulp beaten with a wooden mallet until the fibers surrendered, a slurry stirred by hand until it looked like pale breath in water. The mold dipped forward, lifted level, shaken once side to side and once toward the heart, then drained until the sheet held together under its own delicate courage. The first time she made a sheet that did not tear at the corner, Elias held it up to the light and let her see the uneven cloud of fibers inside it. "There," he said. "That one has a life." Ivy was 13 then, narrow-shouldered and solemn, with hair that would never stay tied and eyes that missed very little. She smiled rarely in those years, but that afternoon her mouth opened in an unguarded way, and Elias looked away toward the lilacs, giving her privacy for the happiness. He was not sentimental. He did not praise quickly. He believed in the dignity of exact work, in the charity of repairing what another person had given up on. When Ivy rushed, he took the tool from her hand and laid it down without anger. When she sulked, he pointed to the chair by the window and waited. Silence in Elias's workshop was never punishment. It was a basin where a person could settle. Once, late in November, while sleet ticked against the porch windows, Ivy tore the corner off an 1820 account book because she had tried to turn 2 damp pages at once. The sound was small. It was hardly a sound at all. Her face went white, and she stood with the ruined page caught between her fingers. Elias came beside her, looked at the tear, and nodded once. "Now you know the page is stronger than your—" He said it only once, but it stayed with her. It did not mean the page was unbreakable. It meant weakness deserved attention. It meant that slow hands could do what anxious hands could not. It meant that what had survived 100 winters had earned the right not to be hurried by a frightened girl. She wrote the sentence later in the back of her brown notebook, not as a quotation but as a rule. By the time Ivy was 19, Elias's hands had begun to fail him. The fingers that once threaded needles without looking now shook over the paste-brush. He spilled tea on a receipt and laughed softly. But Ivy saw how long he watched the stain spread. His cough deepened that winter, and by March he sat more often than he stood. Still, on the last Saturday she spent in his workshop, he made her prepare wheat paste from memory. "Lower," he said when the burner was too high. She turned the flame down. "Again," he said when she poured too quickly. She began again. At noon, he gave her a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with cotton string. Inside were 3 things: his narrow bone folder, a pamphlet he had written by hand on paste recipes and insect damage, and a photograph of a water-powered paper mill somewhere in New Hampshire, its wheel half buried in snow, its windows dark and evenly spaced like closed eyes. "Keep these where damp cannot reach," he said. But damp was not what took them. Elias died in early April, on a morning when the river broke loose from its ice and carried white plates of winter downstream. There was no drama in it. He had gone to bed with a wool blanket over his knees and did not rise. Lorna cried in the bathroom with the fan running. Ivy sat at the kitchen table in his house, both hands flat on the checked oilcloth, listening to relatives speak in lowered, practical voices about estate papers, medical bills, back taxes, auction dates. Her uncle, Preston Vale, arrived that afternoon in a dark coat that smelled faintly of cologne and cold car upholstery. He was Lorna's younger brother by marriage and had been in the family long enough to speak as if he had built it. He had a neat silver beard, polished shoes, and the kind of smile that held itself in place after warmth had left. He worked in property transfers, not as a lawyer, though he let people assume the difference was minor. He carried a leather folio under one arm and set it on Elias's table with the care of a man placing down a weapon no one else had recognized yet. "There are obligations," he said. That was one of his words. Obligations. Another was clarity. Another was realistic. In the weeks after the funeral, Preston became useful in a way that crowded every room. He drove Lorna to the courthouse. He took phone calls on the porch. He made lists. He spoke to Ivy with patient disappointment, as though she were a child insisting on saving rainwater in a cracked cup. He said Elias's house was not truly theirs to mourn, not in any financial sense. He said old properties were liabilities. He said a young woman with no degree, no husband, and no savings needed to learn the mercy of letting go. The heritage objects disappeared in stages. First, the workshop was locked because, Preston said, buyers would need an inventory. Then the key moved from the hook by the pantry to his coat pocket. Then the presses were sold to a dealer from Keene, who loaded them into a van with quilted moving blankets. Ivy stood in the driveway, clutching the strap of her backpack so tightly the canvas edge cut into her palm. "My bone folder is in there," she said. Preston looked at the van, then at her. "Then you should have put it somewhere safe. The pamphlet, the photograph, the cotton string, the wrap parcel from Elias's last Saturday, all of it had been kept in a drawer of the workshop bench. By the time Ivy was allowed back inside, the drawer was empty except for dust and 2 dead flies. She did not accuse him. Accusation would have required a person on the other side willing to be named. Preston had the serene face of a man standing beside a door he had already closed. Lorna changed during those weeks. Not all at once. She became quieter first, then careful, then absent while sitting in the same room. She folded towels with exact corners. She answered questions after a delay. When Preston spoke, she watched his mouth as if instructions might fall from it and shatter if she failed to catch them. Grief had entered her, but so had fear, and the two made a household where nobody touched anything without permission. The final paper was signed on a rainy Thursday at the formica table in Lorna's apartment, 6 months after Elias was buried. Ivy had come home from the church basement with paste under one fingernail and $3 in cash tucked into the pocket of her skirt. On the table lay a manila envelope, a black pen, and Lorna's blue ceramic mug with a crack down the handle. Preston sat upright, not leaning back, not making himself comfortable. That was part of his performance. He wore a charcoal sweater and had taken off his watch, placing it beside the envelope face up, as if time itself were attending.
"This is only a relinquishment of impractical claims," he said.
Ivy looked at Lorna. Her mother was standing at the sink, rinsing a plate that was already clean. Water ran over the porcelain and into the drain. Her shoulders were rounded forward, and a strand of hair had come loose at the nape of her neck. "What claims?" Ivy asked. Preston slid the paper toward her. "The house, any residual contents, and related inheritance matters. Your mother cannot carry this. Neither can you. I do not understand it. That is why I'm explaining." He explained nothing. He moved words around the table until they sounded like furniture being dragged over a floor. Tax burden, title complication, storage fees, probate closure, developer interest, final opportunity. He said the apartment lease depended on clean financial separation. He said Lorna had signed already. He said a refusal would be selfish, though he did not use the word until his eyes had. Ivy's hand went to the cracked mug. It was warm from the rinse water. She remembered being 8 years old and watching Lorna drink coffee from it while snow gathered on the windowsill in Bellows Falls. "Mom," Ivy said. Lorna turned off the faucet. For a moment there was only the sound of the refrigerator motor and rain tapping at the metal fire escape outside the kitchen window. Lorna dried her hands on a towel. She did not look at the paper. She did not look at Ivy. She folded the towel once, then again, and laid it over the oven handle. "Please, sign it." "Ivy, we cannot keep ghosts." 8 words. Ivy counted them later without meaning to. They arranged themselves in her mind like teeth. She signed because she was tired, because grief had made the room narrow, because her mother's silence after those 8 words seemed larger than Preston's folio and darker than the rain. She signed where he pointed. Her name looked wrong on the line. Too thin, too young, not legally powerful enough to surrender a childhood. Preston blotted the page with a square of white paper, though the ink had not smudged. 3 days later, Ivy came home to find 2 cardboard boxes outside the apartment door. Her name was written on them in Lorna's careful hand. The backpack sat on top, zipped shut. A folded grocery bag had been taped to one box to keep the rain off, but the tape had loosened, and one corner was dark with water. Lorna opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. Behind her, Preston's voice spoke from the living room, low and indistinct. "I just need a few weeks," Ivy said. Lorna held the door with both hands. Her wedding ring, from the second marriage that had not lasted, turned loosely on her finger. "I can't," she said. The chain made a small brass curve between them. It was such a little object, hardly thicker than a necklace. Yet it held the whole room away from Ivy. The lamp, the framed picture over the sofa, the smell of lentils from the stove, the mother who had once hummed while paying bills. Lorna reached through the opening and handed Ivy an envelope with $60 in it. She had written no note. Her eyes were red, but dry. Then she closed the door carefully, so the boxes would not be struck by it. Ivy stood there until the hallway light blinked once and steadied. Then she lifted the backpack first. The notebooks were inside. After that, She could breathe. 6 weeks is not long in a calendar. In the body, it can become a country. She spent the first 2 nights in Brattleboro, curled behind a church on Main Street where the brick wall still held some heat from the day. The 3rd night, rain came, and she sat upright until dawn in the bus shelter near the co-op, watching her breath show faintly in the glass. She bought coffee once and made it last 4 hours, warming her hands on the cup after the coffee had gone bitter and cold. From Brattleboro she rode north because a driver at the mission said there were dishwashing jobs in White River Junction. There were not for a girl with no address and no phone that stayed charged. She slept one night in the laundromat until the attendant shook her shoulder with 2 fingers and said he was sorry. She believed him. That made it harder. In Claremont, she mended a torn family Bible for a woman who sold vegetables from a roadside stand, using paste mixed in a paper cup and a strip of Japanese tissue she had kept folded inside a notebook for almost a year. The woman paid her $12 and gave her 2 bruised apples. Ivy ate one behind the library and saved the other for morning. Her money changed shape each day. $60 became $53 after the first bus. $53 became $41 after bread, peanut butter, soap, and a pair of wool socks from a thrift store because her old socks had worn through at the heel. $41 became $32, then $26, then $19 and some coins. She wrote the amounts in the margin of her gray notebook, not because the arithmetic helped, but because recording it made the falling seem less like falling. In Keene she found a women's shelter full, then a church basement open only during the day, then a covered stairwell behind a dentist office where the wind did not reach if she tucked herself close to the brick. She learned which public bathrooms had outlets. She learned that librarians noticed everything and said little unless forced. She learned that a backpack could become a pillow, a shield, and an anchor. She learned to wash her hair in a sink with hand soap and dry it beneath the vent of a restroom heater while pretending to read the notices on the wall. She avoided mirrors, not from vanity. Mirrors demanded a witness. During the 5th week, a storm moved across southern New Hampshire with hard rain and a cold wind that turned every open cuff into a funnel. Ivy spent 2 days in the Keene Public Library, entering when it opened and leaving only when a staff member touched the lights over the magazine racks. She read repair manuals because they were free and because instructions calmed her. Fixing a thing, even in imagination, required a sequence. Remove the damaged material. Clean the joint. Support the weak place. Let cure undisturbed. On the 2nd afternoon, while copying a recipe for reversible paste from a conservation newsletter, she noticed the classified section of a local weekly someone had left folded beside the public computer. The advertisement was small enough to miss. Skankety Tax Action Disposal, former water-powered paper mill, Cold River Road, Alstead, N.H., UNIFE structure. No utilities. No warranty. Buyer assumes removal or restoration obligations. Minimum bid, $1. Contact Cheshire County Clerk. Records Annex. Before December 1. Ivy read it once, then placed both hands flat on the page to keep it from moving, though no wind was inside the library. A paper mill. The words did not rise loudly. They settled. She copied the advertisement into her notebook exactly, including the uneven spacing and the comma after road. Then she looked up Alstead on a library computer and found a town folded into hills, with a history of mills, farms, floodwater, and names that sounded as if they had been spoken by the same families for 200 years. She found mention of Paper Mill Village in a digitized county history, a cluster near the Cold River where rags had once been beaten into pulp and laid into sheets by hand before larger factories swallowed the trade. The entry ended without ceremony. By the 30s, it said, little remained in operation. Little remained. She sat with that phrase until the screen dimmed. At the reference desk, an older librarian with silver hair and a cardigan the color of oatmeal helped her print directions. The woman did not ask why Ivy's hands were shaking. She only said the bus would get her as far as Keene toward Walpole. Then she would need to piece together the rest, maybe through Charlestown, maybe with a county shuttle if it was running. "You have someone meeting you?" the librarian asked. Ivy folded the printed pages. "No. Mom." The librarian studied her face for a careful second, then took a pencil from a mug and wrote 2 phone numbers in the margin. One was for the clerk's office. One was for a church in Alstead that sometimes opened its hall in weather. "Call before you walk too far," she said. Ivy thanked her and meant it. That evening, she counted her money on a table near the back windows. $17.42. The coins made a low, poor sound against the varnished wood. She arranged them by size, then stacked them again. $1 would buy the deed if no one else wanted the burden. The rest might buy distance, a heel of bread, one night of not being asked to move. She took out her oldest notebook, the brown one with a cracked spine, and opened to the page where she had copied Elias's rule years before. Now you know the page is stronger than your hurry. The pencil had faded, but not enough to disappear. The library was closing. Chairs scraped. Someone laughed softly near the entrance. Outside, November had already gathered itself into a dark, wet evening, and the glass reflected Ivy's face over the black shape of the city trees. She looked tired enough to be older than 20 and young enough to be dismissed by anyone with a clean coat and a confident voice. She packed the notebooks first, sliding the oilcloth pouch deep into the backpack beneath her spare socks. Then she added the printed directions, the classified advertisement, the apple core wrapped in a napkin, because she could not bring herself to leave a mess, and the pencil the librarian had loaned her. At the door, she paused beneath the library's warm light and looked down Main Street toward the bus stop. Cars passed with their wipers moving steadily. A man in a red hat crossed the street with a paper bag tucked under his arm. Somewhere nearby, a restaurant vent released the smell of frying onions into the cold. Ivy had no plan large enough to be called a plan. She had a road, a notice, $1, and a trade she had learned beside a patient man in a room full of mended paper. By morning, she would begin moving toward the forgotten mill, and toward the locked iron machine that had been waiting longer than anyone alive could remember. The first bus left Keene while the sky was still the color of pewter, and Ivy sat in the last row with her backpack held upright between her knees. The heater worked in brief, uneven breaths. It blew dust and lukewarm air over her shoes, then stopped long enough for the cold to gather beneath the seats again. Outside the window, New Hampshire moved past in winter fragments, a field silvered with frost, a red barn with one side patched in tin, a line of sugar maples stripped down to their black bones, a farmhouse where one upstairs lamp burned before dawn. She had bought the cheapest ticket that would move her in the right direction, and that meant not a direct journey, but a sequence of almosts. Almost to the town she needed. Almost to the road she had copied. Almost to a place where $1 could still purchase a burden nobody else wanted. At Walpole, she stepped down beside a gas station with 2 pumps and a hand-lettered sign for coffee. The bus pulled away, leaving a smell of diesel in the cold. For several minutes she stood under the station awning and looked at the printed directions folded in her glove. The paper had already softened at the creases. A clerk inside watched her through the window, then returned to stacking cigarette cartons behind the counter. The county shuttle was not running that morning. The woman at the gas station said it sometimes did and sometimes did not, depending on the driver's daughter and whether the van had passed inspection. She spoke kindly, as if unreliability were a local weather pattern rather than an obstacle. "You headed Alstead way?" she asked. "Yes." "Mom." "That's a long walk for—" "I know." The woman glanced at the backpack, then at Ivy's face. She poured coffee into a paper cup and pushed it across the counter without ringing it up. "Road shoulders narrow after the bridge," she said. "Stay where folks can see you." Ivy held the cup with both hands. "Thank you." By mid-morning, she had found a ride from an older man delivering feed toward Drewsville. He said little, which suited her. His truck smelled of cracked vinyl, hay dust, and the sweet rot of apples left too long in a crate. A collie sat between them with its chin on the gear shift, occasionally lifting its eyes to Ivy as if weighing whether she was permanent. The man dropped her at a crossroads beneath a sky that had lowered by degrees. He pointed with 2 fingers. "Alstead's that way. Cold River's colder than its name." She thanked him, and he nodded once before driving off. The walking began there in earnest. The road rolled through bare hardwoods and pastures closed for the season. Ice rimmed the ditches in cloudy shelves. Once, a flock of turkeys moved across a field in a careful dark line, heads bobbing, each bird following the one before it with more faith than sense. Ivy walked on the left when there was a shoulder, and in the grass when there was not. Cars passed rarely. Each one pushed air against her coat and left a fading trace of salt, exhaust, and wet gravel. By 3 o'clock, the temperature had dropped to 26 degrees, and her toes had become distant. She had put on both pairs of socks, but damp had found its way through the left shoe near the sole. She stopped beside a stone wall to eat bread from her bag and the last half of an apple gone brown at the edges. The bread was dry. She chewed slowly, watching a crow balance on a fence post with the composure of a landowner. The county clerk's office would close before she reached it. There was no helping that. The walking had its own deliberate arithmetic, and no amount of worry could make a mile shorter. By late afternoon the light began to thin behind the hills, and the road took on that blue, inward look of winter places before evening enters fully. A half-collapsed hay barn stood beyond a bend, set back from the road with its doors hanging open. The roof was still mostly whole. The field around it had gone tawny and flat. The snow in the shaded places hardened to a crust. Ivy stood at the gate and listened. No engine. No voices. No dog. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay, mouse dust, and cold wood. Wind moved through cracks in the boards with a low, steady sound. She climbed into the hayloft because it was drier there and found a hollow between bales where she could sit with her back against the wall. Beneath one gap in the siding, she could see the road as a pale ribbon, then nothing but fields and the dark line of trees. Night came early. The temperature fell to 18 degrees. She put on every layer she had, wrapped her scarf over her mouth, and tucked her hands beneath her arms. The backpack stayed against her chest with the straps looped around one wrist. She slept in pieces. A truck passed after midnight, its headlights cutting through the barn boards in thin, bright stripes. Somewhere in the rafters, an animal moved once, then settled. Her breath dampened the scarf until it chilled her lips. Near dawn, she woke to the sound of snowmelt ticking from the edge of the roof, though no thaw had come. It was only the barn loosening its frost as the sky lightened. She stood carefully because her knees had stiffened and climbed down with both hands on the ladder rungs. Outside, the eastern edge of the world held a narrow band of pale gold. She walked the last miles with hay on her coat. Alstead appeared not all at once, but as a gathering of human evidence. First a mailbox with 3 names painted on it. Then a line of houses close enough to the road that their porches seemed to watch travelers pass. Then the white steeple of a meeting house lifting above bare maples. By the time Ivy reached the center, her face was numb and her legs felt borrowed. The town was modest, but not empty. There was Whitcomb's Hardware with a green awning and galvanized buckets stacked outside. The Cold River Cafe with condensation in the windows and a chalkboard advertising chicken soup. A post office with a flag snapping in the wind. Bell and Pike Insurance in a brick storefront with lace curtains upstairs. And a narrow shop called Larkspur Used Books where a cat slept in the window beside a stack of farming almanacs. Farther down, she saw a barber pole that no longer turned, a church hall with a ramp added to its side, and a bank building that had become a dentist office. Ivy stood across from the cafe and let the little town steady itself around her. People moved slowly here, not from idleness, but because ice had polished the sidewalk in patches and everyone knew where a careless heel could punish a person. A man carrying 2 sacks of feed lifted his chin at her. A woman in a quilted coat came out of the post office and looked once at Ivy's backpack, then away with the disciplined mercy of country people. The county records annex occupied the first floor of a former schoolhouse beside the municipal offices, a brick building with white trim, tall windows, and a bell cupola that no longer held a bell. A wheelchair ramp crossed the front like a practical afterthought. Near the door, a metal sign read Cheshire County Records Annex. Sub-office hours. Wednesday and Friday, 9-3. It was Wednesday. Ivy checked the printed directions, though she did not need them any more, then opened the door. Warmth met her first, then the smell of paper stored for a long time in dry rooms. Not old paper exactly, but patient paper. Cardstock, folders, map drawers, ink pads, floor wax, the faint metallic tang of filing cabinets. A radiator clanked below a window. Somewhere behind a partition, a copier hummed and stopped. The entry room held 3 wooden chairs, a rack of county notices, and a counter with a brass bell worn smooth on top. Behind it sat a woman in a gray wool vest over a blue blouse, her hair white and cut blunt at the jaw. She wore wire-rimmed glasses on a chain and had the upright posture of someone whose back had refused to forgive decades at a desk. Her hands were broad, square, and capable. A nameplate on the counter read MRS. Helen Armitage, Deputy Clerk. The woman looked up. For one moment, Ivy became sharply aware of herself, the hay on her sleeve, the damp hem of her skirt, the frayed backpack strap, the windburn on her cheeks. She took off her knit cap because indoor rooms seemed to require manners, even when a person had slept in a barn. "Good morning, Mrs." Armitage said. "Good morning. Mom, I called yesterday. About the Cold River property." The clerk removed her glasses and set them on a folded cloth beside the ledger. Her eyes were light brown, steady, and not easily persuaded by drama. "Yes. Mom, you are the young woman from Keene." Ivy nodded. "Mrs." Armitage studied a folder beside her elbow. "You walked in?" "Pardon. How much of the way?" Ivy did not answer quickly enough. The clerk sighed, but it was not unkind. "Come around to the side door. You can sit while I go through this." There was a gate in the counter, and beyond it a narrow work area with file cabinets labeled by town. Alstead, Chesterfield, Dublin, Fitzwilliam, Gilsum. The names moved by like mile markers. Ivy sat in a wooden chair near the radiator. Heat pressed against her legs so strongly it hurt at first. She kept the backpack in her lap. Mrs. Armitage opened the folder and removed several pages clipped together with a black binder clip. "Before anything is signed," she said, "you need to understand what you are taking on." "Yes." "Mom." The clerk looked over the top page. "The building has no certificate of occupancy." "Yes." "Mom." "It has no working electricity, no municipal water connection, and no approved septic system." "Yes." "Mom." "The access road is public only to the turnoff. After that, maintenance responsibility becomes a matter of recorded easement, and the county will not plow it for you." "Yes." "Mom." "The roof is compromised. I have a 2019 inspection noting structural deflection at the rear bay and water penetration along the eastern wall." "Yes." "Mom." "If you purchase, you assume taxes, liability, and responsibility either to restore to code or remove the structure at your expense. The county is selling it this way because no contractor would take it for salvage without charging more than the parcel is worth." "Yes." "Mom." "Mrs." Armitage sat back. "You understand that a $1 deed can become a $10,000 problem before spring." Ivy's hands rested on the backpack. The canvas had warmed against her palms. "Yes." "Mom." "You understand there is no romance in a condemned building." "Yes." "Mom." "You understand the county is not providing shelter, income, tools, or forgiveness." "Yes." "Mom." The clerk watched her longer after that answer. Outside the tall window, a pickup passed slowly, tires whispering through slush. In the workroom behind them, the copier began again, then clicked off with finality. "How old are you, Mrs.?" Armitage asked. Ivy told her. The clerk's mouth tightened, not in judgment exactly, but in calculation. "Do you have counsel?" "No." "Mom." "Do you have family reviewing this?" "No." "Mom." A silence opened. It was not the silence of the workshop she had once known, the kind that made room for repair. This was official silence, lined and stamped, with fluorescent lights above it and forms beneath it. Ivy kept her shoulders level. "Mrs." Armitage tapped one finger on the folder. "I can refuse to process today if I believe you do not understand the instrument." Ivy looked at the pages. The legal words were arranged in dense blocks, but their meaning had become plain enough through warning. It was not a gift. It was a transfer of responsibility. It was a building nobody wanted placed carefully into her empty hands. "I understand that the county wants it gone or made safe," Ivy said. "I understand nobody will fix it for me. I understand it may be more than I can do." The clerk waited. Ivy added, "But I know what it was." "A paper." The answer was so plain that it might have sounded childish. Yet Mrs. Armitage did not dismiss it. She turned a page, then another. Her finger paused on a line in the older title record. "Your full name again." Ivy gave it. The clerk wrote it on a yellow note, then looked from the note to the folder. "Your mother's family. Are they from up Walpole way?" Ivy's grip changed on the backpack. "Some of them. Reed people." The name crossed the room softly and struck something that had not been touched since the funeral. Ivy nodded once. "Mrs." Armitage rose from her chair more slowly than necessary and went to a file cabinet along the back wall. She opened the second drawer from the bottom and thumbed through hanging folders until she found one with a faded blue tab. When she returned, she carried an older survey, folded into quarters, its edges browned. "I knew a man from that family," she said. "Years ago. He brought town record books back from ruin after the flood of '05. Would not take proper payment. Said public memory should not depend on a budget line." Ivy looked down at the floorboards because the room had tilted a little. The radiator hissed. A truck door shut somewhere outside. "He taught me paper repair," she said. Mrs. Armitage laid the survey on the desk between them. "Then you know more than most who have asked about that mill." There were others, 2 contractors, 1 antique dealer, a man from Massachusetts who wanted the beams. None came back after seeing the place. The clerk unfolded the survey. The paper crackled at the creases. A hand-drawn parcel map appeared, showing the river, the raceway, the mill foundation, a cottage outline, and a strip of land reaching toward the road. "This is not current enough for legal boundary reliance, Mrs." Armitage said automatically. "But it may help you find the old track." Ivy leaned closer. Her shadow fell across the drawing. There was. The assessment notes call it attached quarters. Whether it remains habitable, I would not guess. Mrs. Armitage slid a deed packet toward her, then took a brass stamp from the shelf behind the counter. It was heavier than Ivy expected a stamp to be. The clerk positioned the first page, pressed the stamp down with both hands, and the seal rose on the paper in a clean raised circle. The sound was compact and final. "Read where I marked," she said. Ivy read. Not every word, but enough. She signed in blue ink because Mrs. Armitage said blue made originals easier to distinguish from copies. Her name looked no older than it had on the other paper weeks before, but this time no one guided her hand. No one stood at a sink turning away. When the last page was signed, Ivy opened the little change purse from the side pocket of her backpack and took out a single folded dollar. It had been folded twice, then twice again. The corners softened from being counted and saved. Mrs. Armitage accepted it, wrote a receipt, and placed the bill in a shallow drawer beneath the cash box rather than in the cash box itself. "I will make the recorded copy," she said. "It may take a little while." "I can wait." "I imagine you can." The clerk said it dryly, but not cruelly. While the copier worked, Mrs. Armitage wrote directions on the back of a county envelope. Cold River Road east out of the village, past the old cemetery. You will see a split-rail fence on your right and a mailbox with no box left, only the post. The track is after that. If you reach the bridge, you have gone too far." She paused. "Do not cross the raceway boards if they are iced." "Yes." "Mom, do not sleep under the rear bay." "Yes." "Mom, if the floor gives, stay near the sill lines." Ivy looked up. "How will I know them?" Mrs. Armitage took the pencil back and sketched a quick rectangle on the envelope. "Exterior walls carry down. Interior guesses do not. Keep to the edges until daylight tells you better." That was advice a person gave when warning had failed and care had no formal place left to stand. The recorded copy came out warm. Mrs. Armitage tapped the pages into order and slid them into a manila envelope. Then she added the old survey copy, though Ivy had not paid for it. "For reference only," she said. "Yes, Mom." At the door, Ivy stopped. Why did the village fall away? Mrs. Armitage rested one hand on the counter. Water moved. Roads moved. Industry moved faster. Families followed work or buried it. That is the ordinary answer. And the other, The clerk looked through the tall window toward the winter light. Ordinary answers are usually enough. Ivy accepted that. Some places did not need a curse to be abandoned. They only needed time, debt, weather, and a trade no longer measured by hand. She stepped outside with the envelope under her coat. The day had turned bright and severe. Sunlight lay hard on the snowbanks. The wind had a clean blade in it, and the sky above the steeple was cloudless except for a few high white streaks stretched thin as scraped paste. She crossed through the village slowly, because her legs had stiffened from sitting, and because the envelope seemed to alter the weight of each step. At the Cold River Cafe, a woman was taping a new menu to the inside of the window. The post office door opened and shut. A man came out of Whitcomb's Hardware carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. The used bookstore cat had moved only enough to turn its back to the glass. All of it continued, indifferent but not hostile, as if the town were a clock wound by hands long gone. Cold River Road bent east past the church and narrowed after the cemetery. Ivy walked along the stone wall, reading names on markers when the snow allowed them. Some were recent, with polished granite and plastic flowers bright against the winter. Others had leaned back under 2 centuries of frost. Their carvings softened until death itself seemed to have grown modest. Beyond the cemetery, the houses stood farther apart. A white farmhouse with green shutters had smoke lifting from its chimney. A yellow cape had a row of bird feeders outside the kitchen window, and chickadees moved through them in quick black-capped flashes. A brindled dog came to the edge of a yard and barked 3 times, then trotted along the fence as Ivy passed, not angry enough to threaten and not trusting enough to be silent. The road dipped toward the river. She heard the water before she saw it, a steady cold mutter under ice shelves and exposed stones. Walnut trees grew along the lower ground, their branches dark and muscular against the sky. The nuts had long since fallen and gone black in the grass, but their husks still marked the snow in bruised circles. She passed the split-rail fence misses. Armitage had described. One rail had slipped from its mortise and lay half-buried. Then came the mailbox post without a box, its top cut at an angle and furred with lichen. Beside it, nearly hidden by thorn and young pine, an old track turned off the road. Ivy stopped. The track was not a driveway in any modern sense. It was 2 depressed lines through frozen grass, with a ridge of saplings rising between them. Snow lay where wheels no longer went. A rusted chain hung from one post to another, but it was broken in the middle, each end lying in the weeds like something tired of forbidding entry. She stepped over it. The first 100 yards climbed gently, then turned through a stand of young birch. Their white trunks caught the sunlight and made the way appear briefly ceremonial. Beyond them the ground dropped, and the sound of water grew louder. A mill race appeared on the left, lined with stone, partly clogged by leaves, ice, and fallen branches. It ran dry near the top, but held dark-moving water lower down, where the river had found an old habit and kept it. Then she saw the building. It stood at the lower edge of the property, broadside to the raceway, with its rear foundation nearly touching the river stones. The mill was larger than she had imagined from the advertisement, perhaps 60 feet long and 28 wide, built of weathered timber over a stone foundation, with clapboards the color of ash and lichen. The roof was steep, once cedar shake under later metal patches, now bowed in 2 places like a back-grown wherry. A brick chimney rose near the attached cottage end, crooked but still upright, its crown broken at one corner. The water wheel sat on the north side beneath a collapsed lean-to roof. It was overshot, at least 12 feet across, made of blackened wood and iron bands gone orange with rust. Several buckets had broken away. Others held ice, leaves, and one bird's nest from a season no bird remembered. The wheel did not move, but water still spoke near it, slipping through the ruined race and falling in threads over stone. A sign hung above the main door by one remaining chain. Merriwether Handmade Papers. Rag. Linen. Ledger. Book. Most of the paint had failed. The letters were barely legible unless a person stood still and let them emerge. The cottage portion was attached at a right angle to the west end. Smaller. Lower, with 2 front windows and a door beneath a narrow porch roof. The porch had sagged at the left post. One window was boarded. The other held cracked glass that reflected the walnut trees in broken pieces. Ivy could see where the 2 buildings met. Work and dwelling joined under mismatched roof lines, as if livelihood and shelter had once leaned against each other for warmth. She remained at the edge of the clearing for a long time. The county envelope rested beneath her coat, against her ribs. Her feet hurt. Her shoulders ached from the straps. Hunger had become a low, bearable thing. Yet the sight of the place did not disappoint her. It frightened her in a plain and honest way. That was different. She approached by the cottage first, because the mill door hung crooked and the floor beyond it seemed less certain. The porch boards complained under her weight, but held. A brass knob on the cottage door turned loosely without opening. The lock had been broken years before and repaired badly with a hasp. The county had given her no key because there was no working lock left to honor. She lifted the hasp. The screws were loose enough that the whole plate shifted in her hand. The door opened inward with a swollen scrape. Cold air inside met colder air outside, and for a moment nothing changed. Then the house breathed out. Dust. Damp plaster. Mouse droppings. Old soot. Wet wood. A faint sourness of paper long exposed to weather. Beneath those, almost too thin to name, was the dry mineral smell of paste, rags, and time. The front room was compact, with a hearth on one wall and a low ceiling crossed by hand-hewn beams. A narrow staircase climbed along the back, though 3 steps were missing their risers. The floorboards were wide pine, gray with dirt, cupped by moisture, and scattered with plaster fallen from the ceiling in chalky islands. A chair lay on its side near the hearth. Beside it, a rusted stove lid rested like a black plate on the floor. There was wallpaper in one corner, faded to the color of weak tea, patterned with tiny blue flowers. Someone had once chosen it carefully. That struck Ivy harder than the broken glass. She stood just inside the doorway and listened. Buildings made sounds even when abandoned. They ticked, settled, sighed through cracks. This one held itself in a strained hush, not dead, but reserving judgment. The back room connected directly into the mill through a plank door with a thumb latch. Ivy pushed it open and raised one arm against the rush of colder air. The workroom beyond was long and dim, lit by high windows filmed with grime. Shafts of afternoon sun angled through holes in the siding, catching dust in slow golden threads. The ceiling rose higher here, and the beams were larger, dark with age and old moisture. Along one wall stood frames, racks, broken screens, a long table bowed in the middle, and shelves crowded with jars whose labels had browned into silence. Near the center, enormous and still, sat the Hollander beater. It was made of cast iron and heavy timber, with a trough like an oval basin and a roll housing bolted down at one end. Rust had bloomed along the metal ribs. A belt hung slack from a pulley overhead. Its wheel, separate from the water wheel outside, had cracked spokes and a rim polished where hands had once guided maintenance. The machine looked less like equipment than an animal that had gone to sleep while working. Ivy did not go near it then. Dusk had begun gathering in the corners, and misses, Armitage's warning about floors remained sharp in her mind. She backed out carefully, stepping near the walls, then returned to the cottage room. There was no bed. In a cupboard beneath the stairs she found mouse-chewed newspapers, a tin cup, a chipped bowl, and 3 candles melted crooked from summer heat. One still had enough wick to burn. She found no matches until she checked the mantel, where a damp box lay behind a fallen brick. Of the first 5 matches, 3 broke, 1 flared and died, and the last caught the candle with a weak blue bead that slowly became flame. The room changed. Not much. Enough. The candle made the broken plaster warmer, the chair less abandoned, the hearth less like a mouth. Ivy set it inside the cold fireplace where the draft would not take it, then unrolled her spare skirt on the floor near the interior wall. She ate the heel of bread left in her bag and drank from the water bottle she had filled at the library bathroom before leaving Keene. The water tasted faintly of metal and plastic. She drank it anyway. Outside, the river moved under the dark. Wind pressed against the boards and found every crack. Somewhere in the mill, a loose piece of metal shifted once with a soft complaint. Ivy froze, listened, then let her shoulders lower. She took the notebooks out only after the room had settled into night. One by one, she checked them for damp, smoothing the covers with her sleeve. Brown, gray, green, black, the blue one with a torn spine, the ledger book she had rescued from a school trash bin, the narrow red one used for paste recipes, and the smallest, where she copied sentences worth keeping. They had survived the road. They had survived the hallway. They had survived her. She placed them against the wall farthest from the door, wrapped again in oilcloth, then lay down with the backpack beneath her head. The floor was hard. The cold came up through it steadily, as if the earth below were breathing winter into the boards. Her hip began to ache within minutes. She shifted, then shifted again, then stopped moving because discomfort changed nothing except the amount of strength spent resisting it. Through the cracked window, she could see one strip of sky. A few stars had appeared between walnut branches. The candle burned lower, the flame bending whenever the wind found the chimney. She watched it until her eyes blurred. In the darkness, she did not make promises. Promises were large things, and she had seen large things fail. She made a smaller agreement with the room. She would stay until morning. She would learn what daylight showed her. She would not hurry the page. The mill was not empty. It had been waiting. At first light, Ivy found the well by following the deer tracks. They crossed the clearing behind the cottage in 2 precise lines, dipped past a tangle of dead goldenrod, and ended near a stone curb half swallowed by grass. The well cover was made of planks nailed across a square frame, one plank newer than the others and all of them furred with frost. She knelt and brushed away snow with her sleeve, then leaned close enough to smell the cold breathing up through the seams. There was water below. She could hear it when she dropped a pebble through a gap and waded through the long fall. The sound came back faint and round. She did not trust it. On the first day, she carried water from the river and boiled it in the chipped bowl she had found beneath the stairs, setting the bowl on 3 flat stones in the hearth while a handful of broken twigs burned below. The fire was poor, smoky, and brief, because the chimney had not yet been tested, and because she knew enough not to feed flame into a throat packed with 60 years of birds' nests and soot. Still, the water steamed. That seemed like a beginning. The outhouse stood beyond the walnut trees, leaning toward the back field as if embarrassed by its own endurance. Its door hung by one strap hinge. The crescent moon cut into it had been chewed at the edge by weather until it looked less like decoration than damage. Inside, a raccoon had made some former claim, leaving leaves, droppings, and the papery remains of a wasp nest in one corner. Ivy cleaned what she could with a fallen branch and kept her scarf over her mouth. Practical things had no sentiment in them. They only waited to be done. She spent the first 3 days learning the building's body. By morning, the cottage floor spoke differently than it had at night. The board near the hearth gave a flat, certain note. The 2 boards by the east window answered with a hollow click. Along the inner wall, where the sill carried down to stone, the footing felt steady enough. Near the center of the room, one plank bent under her heel, not far, but enough to warn her. She marked it with a piece of charcoal. In the mill room, she moved only along the perimeter, one hand on the wall, stepping where the uprights met the floor. She learned which door needed lifting before it would shut, which window admitted snow when the wind came north, which cupboard kept the mice from her bread if she wedged a broken brick against it. She learned that the roof dripped not everywhere, but in 6 distinct places, each with its own rhythm. One drip struck a tin lid near the back stairs. One landed in a dark stain beside the hearth. One fell from a beam in the mill room and disappeared into the warped floor, as if the house were drinking against its will. At noon on the second day, she found the remains of a path behind the mill that led to the dry upper race. The stones lining it had shifted, but the shape of human work remained. Moss held to the joints. Roots had entered where mortar had failed. There were black walnuts everywhere, their shells split by squirrels, their green husks rotted into the earth. Beyond the race, the river moved with a force that seemed too steady for winter, narrow and dark under shelves of ice. By the 3rd morning, Ivy knew she could not survive on what she had carried. The bread was gone. The peanut butter had been scraped from its jar with the handle of a spoon until only a brown shine remained near the bottom. Her hands had cracked at 2 knuckles. She had slept in all her clothes and still woken shaking before dawn. Hunger made her hearing sharper and her thoughts less orderly, and she disliked that most of all. Work required sequence, so she walked back to town. The road seemed longer going out than coming in, perhaps because destination had become responsibility rather than hope. A weak sun shone through milky cloud. Frost lifted from the grass in pale vapor where light touched it. At the cemetery, she paused to rest one hand on the stone wall and watched a squirrel carry something twice the size of its head across a marker tilted almost flat. Whitcomb's hardware was warmer than it looked from outside. The bell over the door rang once, a full round note, and the smell of the store came toward her with such richness that she nearly stopped in the entry. Coal dust from the old stove near the back. Pine boards. Oiled metal. Rope fiber. Seed packets stored through winter. Kerosene. Coffee burned a little too long in a pot behind the counter. The aisles were narrow, with shelves rising higher than her shoulders and labeled in pencil on strips of masking tape. Hinges. Nails. Sash cord. Stove cement. Lamp wicks. Mouse traps. Copper washers. There were shovels along one wall, handsaws hanging by size, and a glass case with pocket knives, chisels, and brass fittings arranged on faded green felt. The man behind the counter was large through the shoulders and narrow at the hips, with a gray mustache that drooped unevenly and eyebrows so white they seemed to float above his eyes. He wore a canvas apron over a red flannel shirt, and the left lens of his glasses had a permanent scratch shaped like a branch. His hands were scarred in old, pale lines. One thumbnail was black from a recent blow. He looked at Ivy's coat, then at her shoes, Then at the county envelope she had tucked under one arm. "You the one bought Merriwether's," he said. It was not a question exactly. "Yes, sir." He leaned both forearms on the counter. "Name's Nathaniel Whitcomb. Ivy Vale. I figured Mrs. Armitage would talk you out of it." She tried carefully. His mouth moved beneath the mustache. Not quite a smile. "That sounds like Helen." He came around the counter and nodded toward the stove. "Stand by that a minute. You are blue around the mouth." "I'm all right. I did not say you were not." That left no polite way to refuse. Ivy stood near the stove and let heat reach her legs. A black kettle sat on top, ticking softly. A gray cat with one torn ear slept in a wooden nail bin beneath the window, undisturbed by commerce or weather. Mr. Whitcomb took a clipboard from a hook and flipped through papers. "You need—" The question was too large. Ivy looked around at the store, at the vast inventory of possible need, and felt suddenly foolish. Nails, glass, food, rope, matches, a chimney brush, lamp oil, a saw, gloves, something for the roof, something for the floor, time, strength, instruction, a way not to fail before the first thaw. She opened her notebook instead of answering. The list she had begun that morning trembled slightly in her hand. Matches. A chimney brush, if I can afford it. Wire. 2 candles. Flour, if you sell it. A small bag of beans. Maybe stove cement. I need to know what a roof leak costs before I ask about roof leaks. Mr. Whitcomb listened without interrupting. Then he took the notebook, not from her hand but from the counter after she laid it there, and read the list with the seriousness of a doctor reviewing symptoms. "You have cash?" "Some." "How much some?" She told him. He looked toward the ceiling and breathed out through his nose. "That is not some. That is almost none." "Yes, sir." "You got a mailing address?" "No, sir." "Phone?" "No, sir." "Reference?" She looked at him. He scratched the side of his jaw. That was a poor question. From behind the counter, he pulled out a lined index card and wrote her name at the top. Beneath it, in square block letters, he wrote Merriwether Mill account. Then he opened an old metal cash drawer filled not with money but with customer tabs, some yellowed, some new. "I can carry you small," he said. "Not foolish. Not forever. Small. I cannot promise when I can pay." "I did not ask for a promise. I asked if you were trying to make that place stand or tear it apart." "Stand. That answer will do for this week." Ivy swallowed once. The stove heat had begun to make her eyes sting. Mr. Whitcomb turned and reached beneath the counter, bringing out a thick paperback manual with a cracked spine. The cover showed a man on a ladder repairing clapboards, his smile far too clean for the work. The title read Home Repairs for Farm and Village Instructors, 1973 edition. "Take this," he said. "I cannot buy it." "You are not buying it." It came in with a box of National Geographics and has been holding up the back of a drawer. Chapter 4 will mislead you about aluminum windows. Ignore Chapter 4. The chimney section is decent. Roof section is cautious enough to keep you alive. She touched the cover. "Thank you." "Do not thank me until it helps." They built the first list together. 2 boxes of kitchen matches, 12 cents each. 6 candles. Plain white, 9 cents apiece. A 2-pound bag of navy beans, 38 cents. Flour in a 5-pound paper sack, 59 cents. Salt, 11 cents. A small tin of lard, 43 cents. Galvanized wire, 8 feet cut from a roll, 24 cents. One used stiff bristle brush for the chimney smoke shelf. No charge because its handle had cracked and been wrapped with friction tape. A length of clothesline, 15 cents. 3 10-penny common nails by the handful, written as 20 cents. 1 tin cup from a dented box, 6 cents. A paper packet of needles and heavy thread, 18 cents. A bar of yellow soap, 9 cents. He added a chimney sweep brush to the counter, then removed it after glancing at her. Too much, he said. You can borrow mine. He went to the back and returned with a round wire chimney brush, 6 inches across, attached to a bundle of flexible rods. The rods were scuffed, their brass couplings darkened by use. You break a rod, you tell me. Yes, sir. You get that brush stuck, you do not climb onto the roof in panic. You come back here embarrassed and alive. Yes, sir. You have a ladder? No, sir. He closed his eyes briefly, as if asking patience from a private source. Of course not. A boy of about 15 came in carrying a crate of milk bottles and set them by the back door. Mr. Whitcomb told him to bring the short extension ladder from the storage shed. The boy looked at Ivy with open curiosity, then obeyed. The ladder he returned with was paint-spattered, aluminum, and missing one rubber foot, which Mr. Whitcomb replaced from a drawer of rescued parts. Loan, he said. Not gift. Yes, sir. And take the cat food cans from that bottom shelf. Dented ones. Not for you. For the mice. Set them where they are already traveling. They will go to food before notebooks if God shows ordinary mercy. That was the first time he mentioned the notebooks. Ivy did not ask how he knew. Perhaps the shape of the backpack told him. Perhaps Mrs. Armitage had telephoned. Perhaps people who kept old stores learned what others carried. When she left, the load was heavier and the sky had begun to lower again. Mr. Whitcomb had wrapped the beans and flour in brown paper and tied the bundle with string, then wedged the manual under the top flap of her backpack. The ladder was awkward, and she had to stop twice before leaving the village to shift it from one shoulder to the other. At the cafe window, the woman taping menus looked out and lifted 2 fingers in greeting. Ivy nodded back. She was becoming visible. That had dangers and uses. Back at the mill, she set the food on the highest shelf she trusted, then began with the chimney. The manual instructed patience, and so did the structure itself. First, she cleared the hearth of broken brick, ash lumps, mouse nesting, and a rusted damper plate that had fallen halfway from its hinge. She used the crack brush to sweep loose soot from the firebox walls, working from top to bottom as Elias had taught her to clean paste from a basin, never make dirt travel twice. The soot came down in soft black skins. It entered the lines of her fingers, darkened the cuffs of her sleeves, and settled into her throat no matter how she tied the scarf. She checked the flue with the tin cup tied to the clothesline, lowering it carefully from the fireplace opening as far as the smoke shelf allowed. It struck something almost at once. Not a full blockage, but resistance. She lay on her back with her head inside the hearth, holding the candle at an angle and trying to see upward without letting soot fall into her eyes. There were twigs, feathers, a nest pressed against the shoulder of the flue. Beyond it, darkness. The roof was not safe enough for a full top-down cleaning. She knew that the instant she set the ladder against the cottage and climbed 3 rungs. From there she could see the roof planes sagging near the chimney, shingles curled like dry leaves, metal flashing lifted at one corner. To put her weight there would be hurry disguised as courage. So she worked from below. She assembled the rods one by one, twisting the brass couplings tight with cold fingers. The brush entered the flue reluctantly. She pushed, turned, drew back, pushed again. Creosote fell in hard flakes, glossy black and sharp-edged, striking the hearth like broken pottery. The nest resisted until she worked the brush past it, then collapsed in a rush of twigs. Old grass, gray down, and one small white eggshell preserved by dryness. She removed it by hand and set the eggshell on the mantel without knowing why. For 6 hours. She cleaned. Not continuously. Nobody could. She worked in stretches of 20 minutes, then sat on the floor coughing into her scarf, drinking water, flexing her hands. She changed the angle of the rods. She scraped the smoke shelf with the taped brush. She used a bent wire to hook loose clumps from the ledge behind the damper. At one point the brush jammed, and fear went through her so cleanly that she stopped breathing. Then she remembered Mr. Whitcomb's dry warning, sat back on her heels, and turned the rod backward a quarter circle at a time until the bristles released. Late afternoon became evening. The room darkened while the soot pile grew. When she finally held a candle in the hearth and saw its flame lean upward in a steady draft, she did not celebrate. She sat on the floor with both hands black to the wrist and watched the flame move. It was only a draft. It felt like permission. The first true fire was not large. She built it from dry twigs gathered under the mill's overhang, 2 split pieces of wood found stacked beneath a fallen tarp in the lean-to, and curls of birch bark peeled from a dead branch. The flame took slowly, then steadied. Smoke hesitated under the lintel, made one gray hand into the room, and then drew upward. Ivy remained crouched near the hearth until her knees hurt. The chimney pulled. She washed the bowl with boiled water, filled it again, and set beans to soak near the heat, though she knew they would not soften quickly. Hunger overruled proper timing. By dark, she had made a thin meal of flour, salt, water, and a spoon of lard cooked in the chipped bowl until it became something between dumpling and paste. It was uneven, scorched at the bottom, and the finest meal she had eaten in days. Later, when the beans had yielded a little, she added some to the water with salt and drank the broth from the tin cup. Heat changed the room more than candlelight had. It did not make the cottage safe. It did not repair the roof or strengthen the floor. But it drove back the worst of the damp, and with damp went a certain despair that belonged more to the walls than to ivy. Steam rose from her socks near the hearth. Her hands, washed twice with yellow soap, remained gray at the nails. The notebooks stayed wrapped, but she touched the oilcloth before sleeping, as she might have touched the forehead of a child. The next morning, she began the inventory of the workroom. She had learned enough of the floor to choose a path, along the west wall to the long table, across a beam line marked by nail heads, then toward the central machine only as far as the planks stayed firm. She took the red notebook because it was already used for recipes and craft notes, and she made columns. Object, condition, possible use, danger. At the first shelf, she found 12 mold frames, though only 5 had intact screen. 2 decals hung from pegs, their corners loose but repairable. A stack of felts lay in a cedar chest, moth-nipped at the edges yet cleaner than she expected because the lid had sealed well. There were 3 drying racks. 1 collapsed, 2 standing. a rusted hydraulic press with a screw handle frozen at the top, 4 glass jars of pigment, all hardened, a crock labeled size in faded ink, empty except for a gray powder that smelled faintly of hide glue and age, 2 bundles of linen rag tied with string, discolored but dry in the middle, a scale with brass weights, missing the smallest, a paper cutter with a blade so dull it could barely threaten butter, a ledger shelf holding no ledgers, a wall rack of paddles and stirrers, a broken thermometer reading 40 degrees in a room closer to 28. Under the long table, she found a crate of hand tools, a draw knife with one handle split, 3 awls, a hammer with a replaced head, a bone folder not Elias's but worn in the same way, 2 paste brushes hardened solid, and a narrow knife wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow resisted rust. She set that aside with care. There were labels on some drawers, written in ink by a hand that leaned left. Rag sort, wire, felt needles, mud potch, vat screz. She read each one aloud once, not for drama, but to hear the room receive its own language again. Near noon, she reached the Hollander beater. Up close, the machine seemed larger than it had from the doorway. The iron trough was built into a timber frame and lined with metal stained by long evaporated pulp. The roll housing sat at one end like a lowered jaw, with bars inside that had once beaten rag fibers against a bedplate. Hour after hour, until cloth surrendered into paper. A wheel for adjusting pressure rose from the side. Another lever, stiff with rust, controlled the circulation gate. The drive belt above had cracked and hung in a dark loop. Ivy did not touch it at first. Machines deserved the courtesy of being understood before being disturbed. She drew it from 3 angles in the notebook. She labeled the roll: trough, bedplate, gate, drain, pulley, pressure screw, and frame bolts as best she could. Then she tested the wood around it with the handle of a broom. Solid at the front, soft near the drain, hollow under the left side but not immediately dangerous. She placed boards from a fallen rack across the questionable span to spread her weight, then knelt by the machine and brushed dust from the iron rim. The name cast into the side emerged slowly. H. D. Wilcox and Sons. Worcester, Mass. Below that was a serial number, half filled with rust. Something about the left end of the machine troubled her. Not in a mystical way. In a carpenter's way, though she was no carpenter. The boards beneath that end were newer by several decades, but the bolts through the frame were older. The iron side showed a circular plate about the width of both her hands, set low, behind a timber brace where no maintenance hatch logically belonged. It had been painted over once, perhaps twice. Dust lay on it evenly. A person could look at it for years and see only surface. Ivy tapped the trough with her knuckle. The sound was dense, iron answering iron. She tapped the circular plate. The sound changed. Not much. Enough. She took the hammer from the crate and used the wooden handle, tapping along the plate's edge. At the top, dull. At the right, dull. At the lower left, a faintly deeper note, as if something behind it held a little air. She tapped the surrounding iron again and marked the sounds in her mind. Sound test first. Weight test next. The plate had no visible handle, only 4 slotted screws buried under paint and rust. She cleaned one with the narrow knife, working slowly so the slot did not strip. The screw head emerged. Then another. The lower screws were worse. One had been disguised beneath a hardened smear of old pulp or paint. She scraped until her wrist ached. Then she noticed the cedar disc. It lay in a dark gap behind the timber brace, wedged upright where the iron housing met the frame. At first she mistook it for a broken plug. It was about 3 inches across. Cut from cedar, its grain tight and red-brown beneath grime. When she touched it, the disc shifted. She froze. The cedar had not been nailed. It had been fitted. She worked it loose with the point of the narrow knife, easing one edge forward a little, then the other. The smell came first when it moved, faint and clean, cedar still holding its old purpose after decades in darkness. Behind the disc was a recessed iron nut, protected from rust far better than the visible screws. This was not accidental. Ivy sat back on her heels and listened to the mill. Water outside. Wind at the boards. A drip in the far corner landing in its patient tin note. Her own breathing, slower now because the work had become exact. She needed oil and a better screwdriver. She did not have them. For a moment, urgency rose in her hands. It would have been easy to pry badly, to damage the slot, to force the plate because hidden things invite hurry in the young and the wounded. She stood instead, walked to the cottage, and warmed her fingers over the fire until the first sharpness left them. Then she returned with the tin of lard. It was not proper penetrating oil. It was what she had. She rubbed a small amount around the protected nut, then cleaned the visible screws again. From the hardware crate she chose the narrowest chisel and the hammer, set the chisel into the first screw slot, and tapped lightly to break the paint seal. Then she turned. Nothing. She tapped again, turned again. A 1/4 inch. She stopped before greed could ruin it. Each screw took time. The upper right came out first, black threads packed with old paint. The lower left fought for nearly an hour. The hidden nut behind the cedar disc turned with a low, reluctant crack that made her close her eyes. When all 5 fasteners were loose, the circular plate still did not move. She slid the knife around its edge and found a waxed seam. Not paint. Wax. Someone had sealed it against damp. She warmed the knife near the hearth and returned. The wax softened under the blade, releasing a smell faintly sweet and dusty. The plate shifted inward before it came outward, as if pressure from the years had seated it deeper. Ivy braced one hand against the frame and worked the edge carefully until iron separated from iron with a sound like a breath drawn after a long illness. Behind the plate was a dark hollow. She did not reach in blindly. Elias had trained that out of her before she was old enough to name caution. She held the candle near, shielding the flame from draft with one hand. The compartment was rectangular behind the round opening, lined with tin and cedar, perhaps 18 inches deep. Inside sat 3 oilcloth-wrapped bundles, a narrow wooden case, and a tin box no larger than a loaf of bread. No letter was visible at first. She removed the nearest bundle with both hands. The oilcloth had stiffened but not failed. Its knots were tied with linen cord, each one coated in wax. She carried it to the long table, cleared a space with her sleeve, and stood there a moment before untying it. The cord resisted, and she cut it only after trying twice to save the knot. Inside were tools, not valuable in the way Preston would have understood value. Valuable in the way a hand recognizes another hand. A brass-edged deckle knife, 2 agate burnishers wrapped in wool, a bone folder longer and thinner than the one she had lost, ambered by age where fingers had held it, 3 awls with turned maple handles, a small packet of needles blackened but intact, a linen thread ball sealed in paper, a brush with bristles still soft because it had been wrapped in oiled silk. Ivy touched the bone folder with one finger, then withdrew her hand. The second bundle held raw material, sheets of fine linen rag, folded flat and labeled by weight, a packet of kozo fiber, a twist of cotton linter, 2 envelopes of powdered alum, 3 small glass vials sealed with wax and labeled clove, cedar, borate in the same left-leaning hand as the drawers. There was also a folded recipe sheet, but it had been placed beneath the materials, and Ivy did not open it yet. Her hands were too dirty. Her breathing was not steady enough. The narrow wooden case contained mold wires, a tiny brass gauge, a thermometer in a fitted slot, and a hand-cut wooden tool shaped like a paddle with a notched edge. On its handle, carved so finely she nearly missed it, was a symbol, a water wheel crossed with a sheet of paper. Last came the tin box. It had no lock, only a clasp wrapped with waxed cord. The metal was dark green where time had worked on it, but the seams remained tight. Ivy carried it to the cottage because light in the workroom had begun to fade, and because the fire there offered not comfort exactly, but witness. She set the box on the floor before the hearth. The cord broke under the knife. Inside lay a layer of oiled paper. Beneath it was money. Not loose. Not careless. Bundled. Bills first, wrapped in paper bands marked by denomination. Some were large-size notes, wider than modern money, their portraits unfamiliar in the firelight. There were $10 gold certificates with orange backs, $5 silver certificates, worn national banknotes from New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and smaller bills folded together by year. Beneath them were cloth bags of coins, each tied at the mouth with string. Ivy did not count quickly. She brought out the red notebook, drew lines down a fresh page, and wrote what she saw. Bills by denomination. Coins by type. Condition. Markings. She set the tin cup beside her and used it to separate dimes from quarters until she found a rhythm. There were Morgan silver dollars, heavy and cold in her palm, dated from the 1880s and 1890s. Barber half-dollars, standing Liberty quarters worn nearly smooth. Mercury dimes with winged heads. Indian head cents in a paper roll so fragile she did not open it. 3 gold coins wrapped separately in cotton, 2 $5 half-eagles and 1 $10 eagle, each one startling not because it shone, but because it carried such weight in so modest a size. She counted the bills twice. Then the coins. Then she counted again because disbelief could be a form of error. The total, by face value alone, came to $30,000.17. The 17 cents troubled her with its exactness. 2 dimes would have been careless. A rounded sum would have been theatrical. 17 cents made the cash human. Someone had emptied a pocket and decided that even the smallest pieces belonged to the future. At the bottom of the tin, beneath the last cloth bag, lay a small case covered in black leather. The hinge cracked when she opened it. Inside was a military medal on a faded ribbon. Not shining. Kept. The medal was a World War I victory medal. The winged figure darkened with age, the ribbon striped with colors dulled but still distinct. A clasp on the ribbon read Muzargoan. Folded beneath it was a card, browned at the edge, with a name written in ink in the year 1918. Ivy set the medal beside the coins and folded her hands around her knees. The fire settled. One log broke inward, sending up a brief scatter of sparks that died before reaching the hearthstone. Outside, evening had closed over the clearing. The river's sound came through the walls more clearly in darkness, steady, cold, indifferent to paper deeds and human discoveries. There was still the folded sheet from the second bundle. There might be a letter. There might be instructions. There might be a name that would make the room rearrange itself around the past. Ivy did not read it that night. She wrapped the money again, not as tightly as before because her hands had begun to shake. The coins returned to their bags, the bills to their bands, the metal to its case. The tools she left on the floor beside her, lined up on a clean cloth, not for display but because she could not bear to hide them again so soon. The recipe sheet she placed beneath the tin cup, weighed against any stray draft. Then she rose, took the candle, and went outside. Cold struck her face cleanly. The clearing lay under a hard scatter of stars. The mill roof made a dark broken line against the sky, and the water wheel stood motionless in its cradle, each spoke holding a little snow. She walked past it to the raceway and stood where water, freed from the old channel, slipped over stone and joined the river in thin silver threads. For a long time, she watched the water move. It did not hurry because she had found money. It did not pause because a young woman with soot at her cuffs had opened a sealed place in an abandoned machine. It had been moving before her, before Elias, before the left-leaning hand on the labels, before the metal ribbon faded in the dark. It would keep moving after her unless stone, frost, or human work changed its course. That steadied her. The discovery was not rescue in the way stories like to make rescue bright and immediate. The roof still sagged. The chimney still needed work. Her shoes were still cracked. The county would still expect taxes and safety. $30,000 hidden in a machine could vanish quickly if fear learned to spend it. She knew that without being taught. But beneath the fear, something else had entered the room with the open tin box. Not triumph, not certainty, a quieter permission. She returned before the candle burned too low, barred the door with the broken chair, and lay on the floor beside the wrapped bundles. She did not sleep for a long time. Once, near midnight, she reached out and touched the oilcloth around the tools, pressing 2 fingers against the place where the bone folder lay. The mill was not empty. It had been waiting. Morning came through the cracked window in a narrow, colorless blade, and Ivy knew before she touched the folded sheet that the handwriting belonged to the same person who had labeled the drawers. It leaned left with a disciplined slant, each capital restrained, each period pressed deep enough to bruise the fibers. The ink had browned, but not faded evenly. Some lines remained sharp where the pen had carried more weight. Others thinned where the writer's hand must have paused or weakened. The paper itself was ragstock, handmade, with a faint watermark visible when Ivy held it toward the light. The same water wheel crossed with a sheet of paper that had been carved into the handle of the tool. She had slept little, and what sleep came had broken apart whenever the fire settled or the wind lifted at the roof. The wrapped bundles lay where she had left them. The tin box rested close beside the hearth. The metal case sat on top of it, no longer hidden and not yet understood. She washed her hands first, though the basin water was so cold it stung. She scrubbed beneath her nails with the yellow soap until the skin reddened. Then she dried her fingers on the least dirty corner of her apron and sat on the floor with the letter across her knees. There was no envelope. The sheet had been folded into itself, then sealed with wax at one point, the seal broken when the bundle opened. Along the outer fold, written in smaller letters, was one instruction: for the one who opens the beater after me. Ivy laid the paper flat on the boards and smoothed it once. Along the crease, not against it. Then she read, "My dear one, whoever you are, if this paper has reached your hands, then the old machine kept its trust longer than I expected, and you have shown more patience than most. The Hollander does not give up its secrets to force. It was built for beating cloth into pulp, and it knows the difference between a hand that listens and a hand that takes. I write in the back room of Merriwether Handmade Papers on the 20th day of October, 1931. The walnut leaves are down, and the river is low enough that the stones in the race show their shoulders. I have shut the wheel for the season. I do not know whether I shall open it again. In September I went by train to Boston, to Massachusetts General Hospital, where Dr. Alton Pierce examined the place beneath my left breast and told me the truth as carefully as a decent man could. He said the disease had traveled farther than he liked, and that any operation now would be a hard bargain with a short creditor. I thanked him because he did not speak to me as if I were foolish or already gone. I came home by the afternoon train with my gloves folded in my lap and the smell of coal smoke in my hair. I am writing because a trade can die more quietly than a person, and for that reason it is in greater danger. My name is Elspeth Merriwether Hale, daughter of Ruth Merriwether Gannett and Thomas Hale, granddaughter of Abel Merriwether, and great-granddaughter of Josiah Merriwether, who came up from Suffield, Connecticut, in 1788 with a wagon of tools, 2 linen molds, a wife named Mercy, and more stubbornness than money. Josiah built the first vat house on this ground in 1791, when Alstead still spoke more often of pasture than industry. His son, Nathaniel Merriwether, enlarged the race in 1826 and set the first stamping engine where the lower shed now stands. My grandfather Abel replaced that engine with the Worcester Hollander in 1874, after saving for 7 years and arguing with every man who said a woman could not judge pulp by touch. He married Lydia Pike from Ackworth, who could couch a sheet straighter than any apprentice in Cheshire County. My mother, Ruth, learned the trade at 12 and lost 2 fingers to the cutter at 19. She never allowed that to become the story told first about her. She married a schoolmaster, kept the accounts in a black ledger, raised 4 children, and made the finest ledger paper this mill ever sold. I was the last child and the only one who stayed. The date that closed us was not a death, though death had been here enough. It was March 3, 1927, when the bank in Keene refused renewal on the operating note and the new paper concern in Massachusetts underbid our last school contract by nearly half. We had survived floods, rag shortages, fire in the drying loft, the year without orders after the panic, and one bitter spring when the wheel froze so hard we had to chop ice from the buckets with hatchets. But we did not survive cheap paper made far away by machines no hand in this valley would ever meet. I locked the front door to customers that evening. I remember the exact sound of the key because it was not loud enough for what it ended. For more than 30 years after, I kept the place as I could. I made paper by commission when someone remembered us. Deeds, marriage certificates, a minister's sermon paper, a bride's letter paper with violet fiber at the edge, repair sheets for 2 libraries after water damage. Mostly I mended books and wrote receipts for work too small to save a mill. People began calling this place the old paper shop before I had agreed that it was old. The men of my family did not leave because they lacked devotion. They were taken by the uses history makes of ordinary households. My father, Thomas Hale, served in the war between the states with the 14th New Hampshire Volunteers and came home from the Shenandoah with a cough that kept him company until his grave. My husband, Samuel Hale, died in 1918 at the Meuse-Argonne, wearing a uniform he had no childhood reason to imagine. Our son, Peter, died of influenza at Camp Devens the same year, before he saw France. My brother Nathan carried shrapnel from below wood and lived 20 more years without forgiving the sound of sudden thunder. The metal in the box was Samuel's. Keep it from damp. If you cannot keep anything else, keep that. Now I will set down what practical knowledge I can. For rag paper, sort linen and cotton separately. Linen gives strength and a clearer rattle when dry, but it requires longer beating. Soak clean white linen in rainwater for 2 days if the weather is mild, longer if the cloth is tightly woven. Change the water if it smells sour. Cut to pieces no larger than a walnut. In the Hollander, begin with enough water that the roll does not labor. Let the rag circulate with the roll raised for 1 hour to loosen, then lower by quarters, never all at once. For writing paper, beat linen 4 to 6 hours, cotton 3 to 4, until a pinch of pulp drawn between the fingers makes no visible threads longer than a grain of rice. Do not overbeat for book repair sheets. You need the fiber to remember length. Keep the vat between 68 and 74 degrees Fahrenheit when you can. Colder water slows drainage and tempts impatience. Warmer water makes the sheet too eager and uneven. Stir from the bottom before every pull. Dip the mold nose first. Level the wrists. Lift in one motion and shake once left to right. Once toward yourself. Then stillness. Too much shaking makes a nervous sheet. For couching, wet the felts first and wring them evenly. Lay the mold down from the near edge, roll the weight of your hands forward, and lift the mold as if asking permission. If the sheet clings, do not slap the screen. Breathe. Touch the corner, and try again. For paste against insects, use wheat starch washed 3 times until the water runs clear. Cook 1 part starch to 5 parts water over low heat, stirring with a clean wooden spoon until translucent. When it cools to blood warmth, add powdered borate at 1 teaspoon to the cup, cedar oil 3 drops to the cup, and clove no more than 1 drop, or the smell will betray the work. For book spines troubled by silverfish, mix in a pinch of alum no larger than a pea for every 2 cups. Strain through muslin. Use within 3 days in winter, 2 in summer. Never paste over dirt. You will only teach decay where to hide. Dry sheets between felts under steady pressure for 12 hours, then change to dry boards and stack with weight for 2 days. If cockling begins, you rush the press or your loft air is uneven. The paper will tell on you. It always does. You may wonder why I hid money instead of paying every debt. I paid the living debts I could honor. The rest belonged to a system that did not know how to value what it was ending. This money is not for comfort first. Comfort has a way of spending itself and leaving no descendants. Use it to keep the roof from weather, the chimney from fire, the tools from rust, and the trade from becoming a paragraph in a county history. Spend slowly. Write down every coin. The exactness is part of the respect. If you opened this because you were hungry, eat. If you opened it because you were cold, buy fuel. The dead should not ask the living to freeze for an idea. But after you are fed and warm enough to think, remember that inheritance is not what arrives polished. It is what arrives unfinished and asks whether your hands are willing. I had no daughter who lived to take this from me. My little Anna was born in February of 1892 and buried when the apple trees bloomed. I do not write that sentence often. The paper under my hand accepts it better than people do. If you are a daughter of this blood, welcome. If you are not, welcome. Blood has been given too much credit in this world and care not nearly enough. There is a marker for the family ground behind the walnut nearest the race, where Samuel hung an iron horseshoe after our wedding because he said even a papermaker should allow one superstition. The graves are modest. Do not trouble yourself with marble. A clearing of leaves will do. When you make your first sheet, put 1 blue thread in the corner for Ruth, who taught me to judge pulp by the drag on the wrist. Put 1 brown thread for Abel, who trusted women with machinery before the law trusted them with much. Put 1 white thread for anyone whose name has been lost. Let the sheet dry slowly. The lost deserve no hurry. I do not know your face. I do not know the year in which you stand. I do not know whether the wheel still turns, whether the village still remembers us, or whether this room has become only shelter for mice and weather. But I know that your hands reached this letter without breaking the machine, and that tells me enough to write the last lines plainly. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elspeth Merriwether Handmade, Cold River Road, Alstead, New Hampshire, October 20, 1931. Ivy read the letter once while the room brightened, and once again after the fire had burned low enough to show only a red heart beneath ash. The second reading was slower. She stopped at the technical instructions and followed them with her finger, not because she would remember every ratio, but because the woman who wrote them had trusted detail more than persuasion. At the names, she paused. Josiah, Mercy, Nathaniel, Lydia, Ruth, Abel, Elspeth, Samuel, Peter, Anna. They did not rise like ghosts. They settled like tools laid carefully on a bench. When she reached the closing again, Ivy did not cry in any visible way. She folded the sheet along its original creases, pressing each fold with the side of her thumb, exactly where the fibers already wanted to bend. Then she slipped it between two clean boards from the drying rack and placed the boards beneath the tin box, flat, protected from the warped floor. The morning had turned pale and dry outside. She took the metal case, the old survey copy, and the candle stub, then went out through the back door because the letter had mentioned the walnut nearest the race. The ground behind the mill rose slightly before dropping toward the water. Frost held in the shaded grass. The walnut trees stood leafless, their black limbs writing hard lines against the sky. She found the nearest one by the race easily enough, but the horseshoe was not obvious. Lichen covered the bark, and old scars had healed into ridges. She circled once, then again, brushing snow from roots with the toe of her shoe. On the north side, where the trunk bent away from the prevailing wind, an iron horseshoe had grown halfway into the wood. The tree had swallowed the upper curve, leaving only the lower arms visible, black with age and rust. Someone had hung it there with a square nail long ago, and the walnut had spent decades closing around it, not rejecting the iron, not freeing it, simply keeping it. Ivy touched the exposed metal with 2 fingers. It was colder than bark. Below the tree, a low rectangle of stones marked the family ground. No fence remained. No carved markers stood upright. There were 5 field stones, perhaps 6, depending on whether one half-buried shape belonged to the pattern or the river's ordinary scatter. Ivy knelt and cleared leaves from the nearest stone. Beneath the leaves, moss held the surface soft and dark. No name could be read. Perhaps there had never been one. Perhaps winter had taken it grain by grain. A clearing of leaves will do. She used both hands. The work was simple. It took time because the leaves were wet and frozen in layers. She cleared around each stone until the rectangle showed plainly. Then she set the metal case on the central flat stone and opened it. The ribbon stirred once in the wind, a small dull color against winter ground. No ceremony came to her. She knew no prayer that fit a soldier she had not known, a woman who had hidden exact instructions in an iron machine, and a child born and buried before the apple bloom. So she stood with her hands folded in her sleeves and let the river speak on her behalf. After a while, she closed the case and carried it back inside. The candle mentioned nowhere in the letter, yet it became part of the day because she found it while looking for a safer place for the metal. In the mill workroom, behind a stack of damaged felts, there was a wall cupboard she had not opened because its lower hinge was cracked. Inside lay a bundle of wick, 3 glass jars, and one beeswax candle wrapped in yellowed paper. A date had been written on the wrapper in pencil, 1871. The candle was thick. Hand-dipped, its surface bloomed white with age. Most people would have kept it unburned because old things appear more valuable when unused. Ivy held it in her palm and looked at the wick. A candle that had waited through 6 decades and more had not been made to become a museum object in a ruined room. It had been made for light. She set it in the blackened iron holder on the cottage mantel as evening came. The first match failed. The second took. The wick resisted, then caught with a small blue base and a steady gold flame. Beeswax softened. A faint honeyed smell entered the room, mingling with soot, cold boards, and the navy beans simmering in the bowl. The flame did not flicker as sharply as the tallow candles had. It stood calmer, as if age had taught it composure. By its light, Ivy took out the names of the living who had carried her this far without knowing the whole of it. The gas station woman who had poured coffee and warned her about the bridge shoulder. The feed truck driver with the collie who had let silence ride between them. The librarian in Keene who wrote numbers in the margin and did not ask for proof of deserving. Mrs. Armitage, who had warned her like a clerk and helped her like a neighbor. Mr. Whitcomb, who had opened an account not because it was safe, but because the answer stand had been enough for 1 week. She wrote each one in the red notebook beneath the inventory of tools, leaving a line between the practical list and the human one. Flour, 59 cents. Beans, 38 cents. Nathaniel Whitcomb, credit extended. Helen Armitage, survey copy. Unnamed librarian. Directions. Unnamed woman at Walpole Station. Coffee. The page looked odd with kindness entered beside hardware. Then again, perhaps it was not odd at all. If you are watching this tonight from a warm room, maybe there is a small kindness somewhere in your own life that did not announce itself when it arrived. Maybe it was a ride in bad weather, a meal left without a name, a teacher who kept a door open after hours, a neighbor who fixed something and refused money, or a stranger who spoke to you as if you were still a person when you had nearly forgotten how that felt. If one comes back to you now, write it down somewhere. Not for display, not to make it larger than it was, only to keep it from vanishing. Some gifts are small because small is the shape they needed to take in order to reach us. Ivy tore no page from the notebook. She made no vow at the fire. She only sharpened the pencil with the narrow knife, because the point had dulled, and copied the paste formula onto a clean page in her own hand. 1 part starch to 5 parts water. Burete. Cedar. Clove. Alum no larger than a pea. Strain through muslin. Use within 3 days in winter, 2 in summer. After that, she opened the tin box again and counted out no money. Instead, she returned everything to order. The bills remained wrapped. The coins stayed in their cloth bags. The metal case went on the mantel beneath the burning candle. The tools were placed inside the cedar chest, raised from the floor on 2 bricks. The letter rested between boards. The recipe copy went into her red notebook, where damp could not reach easily if the oilcloth held. Only the bone folder stayed beside her. Not the lost one. Not Elias's. Another hand-worn instrument, shaped by another life of careful pressure. She placed it on the floor within reach, then unwrapped her notebooks and set them one by one against the inner wall. The wind rose after midnight. It came over the ridge and down along the river, pressing at the cottage, finding the cracked glass and the lifted flashing, making the whole roof murmur in its sleep. Ivy fed the fire once, then let it lower. Fuel mattered. The candle burned shorter, the 1871 wax making a shallow pool in the holder. She lay down with the heirloom tools on one side and the notebooks on the other. The floor remained hard. The room remained cold beyond the reach of the hearth. Yet the darkness no longer seemed vacant. It held names now, and ratios, and the mild scent of beeswax, and a horseshoe held in the living body of a tree. Ivy turned onto her side, facing the hearth, and tucked both hands beneath her cheek. The flame made the metal ribbon glimmer once before going still. The first snow that stayed came on December 4, laying 4.5 inches over the clearing by noon and making every weak place in the roof show itself by evening. It did not fall prettily. It came on a north wind in hard grains at first, then thickened into flakes that struck the windows and clung to the cracked glass. By dusk, the mill roof wore a white burden along every sag. Inside the cottage, water began to appear in places where only stains had been before. One dark spot near the hearth opened into a steady drip. A second formed above the stair. In the workroom, snow sifted through a split in the eastern slope and lay in a narrow white line across the floorboards. Ivy set bowls under what she could catch, tin lids under what she could not, and moved the notebooks twice before trusting any corner. The manual from Whitcomb's Hardware lay open beside the fire, weighted with the tin cup and the narrow knife. She had read the roof chapter once through in the store's yellow light while Mr. Whitcomb rapped nails. She read it again that night with her coat over her shoulders. Before dawn, when the fire had dropped low and her feet were numb, she read it a third time aloud, stopping after every paragraph to look up at the ceiling as if the words might arrange themselves into rafters. The chapter began with warning. Do not repair from above what is failing below. She copied that sentence into the red notebook. In daylight, she climbed only high enough on the borrowed ladder to measure and see. The roof over the cottage was the immediate danger, not because it was largest, but because it sheltered the chimney, the hearth, her food, the tools, the letter, and the narrow place where she slept. The slope measured roughly 18 feet from ridge to eave and 22 feet along the front run. The rear run was shorter where the cottage joined the mill wall, but worse where water had gathered behind failed flashing. The roof was old cedar under later asphalt patches, with a tarred strip near the chimney that had cracked into scales. She did the arithmetic on the back of a paper flour sack. 2 roof planes, allowing waste. 6 bundles of 3-tab shingles would cover the cottage if she cut carefully and did not make prideful mistakes. 1 roll of 15-pound felt. 5 pounds of roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch galvanized. 1 small coil of flashing, if Mr. Whitcomb would cut from a remnant. Roofing cement, a chalk line, a utility knife. She already had a hammer, though not the right one. She needed roof brackets, but could not afford them. She needed courage less than she needed safe footing, and the manual was firm about knowing the difference. She walked to town with the measurements folded inside her glove. Mr. Whitcomb listened while she read them from the flour sack, then took the paper, turned it over, and recalculated without comment. His pencil moved faster than hers and with less hope in it. Your waste allowance is too low, he said. I measured twice. That is not waste. Waste is the piece you cut backward because your hands are cold and your mind is on supper. He added half a bundle to the total, then crossed it out. No, 6 will do if you keep your scraps sorted. I cannot pay for 6. I know. He went into the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet, its head dark with age, its handle smooth and short. The gauge had been filed by hand along one side. Someone had carved initials into the hickory, now softened by use. This was my father's, he said. He roofed barns before knees became personal enemies. It will set a nail better than that clawhammer you have been abusing. I cannot take that. You are borrowing. For how long? Until the roof is done or you fall off and I have to fetch it myself. She accepted it with both hands. He delivered the materials the next morning in a pickup, the color of primer, stacking shingles under the cottage porch roof while Ivy held the door against the wind. With him came a man she had not seen before, thin as a fence rail, wearing brown coveralls, rubber boots, and a cap with ear flaps tied up by strings. His face was narrow and lined deeply around the mouth. One eye watered in the cold. The other missed nothing. "This is Amos Pike, mister." Whitcomb said, "He heard you were fixing Merriwether's." "I did not hear," Amos said. "You told me." "I told you because you were listening." Amos looked at the roof, then at Ivy, then at the ladder with one rubber foot replaced. "That ladder is poor." "It is what I have," Ivy said. "No. It is what Nate had no shame lending." "Mister." Whitcomb said nothing to that. Amos had been a roofer before his back stiffened into a permanent objection. He was 76, perhaps more, and moved with a hitch that made every step seem negotiated in advance. He would not take pay. He made that clear before Ivy could offer anything she did not have. "My mother's wedding certificate came from this mill," he said. "Blue thread in the corner. Still in my sister's Bible." That was his full explanation. The work lasted 11 days. Not 11 romantic days of bright progress, but 11 patient days of climbing. Measuring, scraping, prying, carrying, and stopping whenever wind made the ladder unsafe. Amos did not climb above the first few rungs. He stood below with his hands in his coat pockets and corrected her without raising his voice. "That nail's proud." Ivy pulled it. "Lines." She snapped it again. "Do not trust tar." She cut away more. 3 strokes. No dancing. She practiced until the roofing hatchet learned her arm. First stroke to set, second to drive, third to seat flush without bruising the shingle. When she needed a fourth, Amos made her pull the nail and begin again. The worst part lay near the rear where the rafter had taken water. Amos made her open the roof wider than she wanted, and the hole frightened her because it showed sky where shelter ought to be. The end of one rafter was punky, dark enough to crumble beneath the awl. Amos stood below and described the sister rafter as if reciting a recipe. Cut sound wood back to strength. Match the depth. Lap far beyond rot. Fasten with carriage bolts. Not faith. Ivy shaped a length of 2x6 from Whitcomb's salvage pile. Drilled through with a borrowed brace, and bolted the sister alongside the failing member while snowmelt dripped down her sleeve. "Good," Amos said after testing it. It was the first praise he gave, and it was small enough to believe. They worked ridge to eave, felt laid straight and overlapped. Chalk lines snapped blue against black, shingles staggered, tabs aligned, flashing, eased under the course above the chimney rather than smeared over the wound like an apology. Ivy's fingers split at the tips. Her shoulders burned at night so fiercely she could not find a side that did not hurt. Twice she climbed down and sat on the porch step with her head between her knees until the dizziness passed. On the 9th day, Mr. Whitcomb brought a thermos of coffee and a paper sack of biscuits from the cafe. Amos accepted one, broke it in half, and ate without removing his gloves. "Too pale," he said. "They were free, mister." Whitcomb answered. "Still pale." Ivy ate her slowly, facing the roof, counting completed rows. The snow beyond the clearing had begun to harden in the shade. The water wheel remained motionless, its buckets holding white crescents. Above the cottage, however, the new shingles lay flat and dark, obedient under the chalked order of her labor. By December 15, the front and rear slopes were closed, the chimney flashing tucked, the ridge capped, and the worst holes gone from the part of the building where she lived. That evening, snow fell again, soft this time, and Ivy sat by the hearth listening for drips. There were 2 in the mill room, 1 near the stair, none above her bedroll. She wrote that in the notebook as if entering a miracle, then crossed out miracle and wrote result. January began with a chimney shedding itself into the hearth. The first brick fragment fell before dawn and struck the ash bed with a muted tap. Ivy woke at once. The fire had gone out hours earlier, leaving only a gray powder and a faint red seam in one buried coal. She held the candle toward the firebox and found a crescent of brick face lying near the andirons, its outer side orange, its inner side blackened by years of smoke. When she touched the chimney breast above the mantel, fine mortar sifted down like dirty flour. By daylight, the damage declared its extent. The lower stack was sound enough, but above the smoke chamber the bricks had begun to spall, their faces flaking where moisture had entered and frozen. Several joints had lost mortar almost to the depth of Ivy's first knuckle. Around the chimney shoulder outside, the new flashing had stopped water, but it could not restore what water had already done. The manual called for repointing. Amos, when he came to inspect, called it slow punishment. "Can it wait?" Ivy asked. He looked at the chimney for a long while. Fire never waits politely. That answered enough. Mr. Whitcomb sold her what he could and gave her what nobody else had wanted. Hydraulic lime in a half-used bag. Fireclay from a torn sack folded twice and tied with twine. Mason's sand screened through hardware cloth. A narrow pointing trowel with a bent heel. A jointer worn nearly smooth. He made her buy gloves because he said lime did not care how noble a person's reasons were. The mix, written under his supervision, was exact enough to steady her. For exterior and upper joints, 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, a 1/4 part Portland only where weather demanded hardness, though Amos disapproved of too much Portland in old brick and said so 3 times. For firebox-adjacent repair, 2 parts sand, 1 part fireclay, 1 part lime, dampened slowly until it held shape on the trowel without slumping. No soup. No dry crumbs. Let the old brick drink first. Mist. Wait! Then pack. Ivy copied it twice. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that lived mostly in the 20s. Some mornings the thermometer nailed outside the cottage door read 17, and she waited until the room warmed above, freezing before mixing anything. Mortar that froze before curing would fail, and failure had already spent enough years in those joints. She hung a canvas drop cloth from 2 nails near the hearth to hold heat close, set pans of warm water near the bricks, and worked in small batches no larger than she could use in 30 minutes. First came raking. With an old screwdriver ground to a narrow point and a stiff brush, she removed loose mortar joint by joint, never gouging sound material, never widening for the sake of speed. The dust fell into her hair, onto her shoulders, into the lines at her wrists. She wore the scarf over her mouth, but lime dust still found the skin beneath her nose and left it raw. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb even inside gloves because she had to remove them for the finer work. She would stop, flex each hand near the stove, then return before warmth could convince her to quit. The spalled brick she could not replace entirely. Not yet. Amos taught her how to cut back loose faces to sound material, dampen the surface, and build shallow repairs in layers where the manual allowed it. He did not like patching brick faces. He said replacement was honest and patching was sometimes vanity. Then he looked at her supply pile, her money ledger, the weather, and the roof above them. Sometimes honest waits, he said. He showed her how to press mortar deep into the joint with the edge of the trowel, packing from the back outward so no hollow place remained. Your wrist tells you, he said. Air feels different. He made her strike the joints concave to shed water, then brush lightly only after the set began, not while the mortar was wet and vulnerable. She ruined the first batch by making it too loose. The second she let dry too far before packing. The third held. After that, the chimney began to accept her. She worked up from the lower breast, then inside the firebox, then the smoke shelf, then outside on the short ladder when weather allowed. Her arms darkened with soot again. The skin over her knuckles cracked open and closed with each day's labor. At night she rubbed lard over the splits because there was nothing better to use, and slept with her hands wrapped loosely in strips cut from an old cotton rag. On January 18, the cold sharpened until the river ice thickened at the edges and the outhouse door stuck in its frame. Ivy did not mix mortar that day. She carried firewood from the fallen lean-to, sorted nails from a rusted coffee can, and sat near the hearth reading the letter's instructions again. Not the lineage this time. The craft. Temperatures. Radios. The warning against pasting over dirt. Never paste over dirt. You will only teach decay where to hide. She wrote it on a scrap of paper and tucked it into the manual. By late January, the repaired joints had cured enough for a test fire. Amos came for that, and so did Mr. Whitcomb, though both men pretended the timing was incidental. Amos stood with his chin lifted toward the chimney as Ivy built a small fire of dry kindling, then added one split log. Smoke rose, hesitated, and drew cleanly upward. No gray hand entered the room. No bitter smoke pressed beneath the mantel. Outside, Mr. Whitcomb walked around the cottage and looked at the stack. Clear, he called. Amos grunted. Inside, the fire brightened. Flame moved along the log with a quiet confidence the old chimney had not allowed before. Ivy watched the throat above the hearth. It pulled steadily. No cough, no spill, no wavering betrayal. Her hands rested on her knees. Palms up, gray with lime at the creases. The mill was not empty. It had been waiting. Amos heard nothing of the sentence because she did not speak it aloud. She only rose, filled the kettle, and set it over the fire so the repaired chimney could carry the first steam of clean work into the winter air. The floors could not be made beautiful until they were made safe, and Ivy had learned by then that safe often looked rough for a long while. The cottage room was white pine, mostly original, fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails in the older boards and later wire nails where someone had repaired in haste. The planks varied in width, some nearly 14 inches across, others narrow replacements fitted without care during a decade when keeping rain out had mattered more than matching grain. Dirt had settled deep between them. Old varnish remained only in protected corners, dark and alligatored. Near the hearth, ash and boot grit had worn the surface gray. Near the east wall, water stains spread in overlapping shadows. She began with fastening. Loose boards came first. She walked slowly, heel to toe, listening for lift, squeak, hollow answer. When a plank moved, she marked it with chalk. Where the original rosehead nails still held, she left them. Where they had risen proud, she set them gently with a nail set borrowed from Mr. Whitcomb tapping until the head sat below the future sanding line without splitting the aged wood. Where later nails had rusted through, she replaced only what had failed, using cut nails when she could afford them and salvaged square nails when she could straighten them without weakening the shank. She found 3 boards too soft to trust, 2 near the window. One at the center, the plank she had marked during the first days. Amos helped her lift them, though help mostly meant standing above and telling her when she was prying wrong. Beneath, the joists were better than she feared, except for one edge where old water had softened the top. She sistered a short support there with salvage lumber, brushing away mouse nesting, acorn shells, and dust that had not seen light since before she was born. The replacement planks came from the collapsed drying rack in the mill room. They were not floorboards originally, but they were white pine, straight enough, dry enough, and already part of the building. Ivy planed the edges by hand as best she could, checking fit again and again, shaving a little, returning, shaving less. Perfect would have been dishonest. Honest was snug, level, and willing to age in place. The sander came from a rental shelf at Whitcomb's, a random orbit machine with a cord repaired near the plug and a switch that needed firm pressure to hold. $14 a day, written on the account card with a line under it. Ivy rented it for 1 day because 1 day was all she could bear to owe for a tool that consumed sandpaper and electricity she did not have. Mr. Whitcomb loaned her a small generator as well, muttering that it hated old gas and would teach her language she should not use in church. She bought sanding discs in 3 grits because the manual and Mr. Whitcomb agreed on that much. $80 to cut the grime in raised grain, $120 to refine, $220 to soften without polishing the life out of the boards. The first pass was loud enough to fill her skull. Dust rose in pale clouds despite the sander's cloth bag. She wore a scarf, opened the door, and worked in strips, never lingering long enough to dish the pine. Under the gray, the wood emerged dark honey. Under the dark honey, in places, came something deeper, almost mahogany where age, smoke, and oil had entered the grain. The knots stood like islands. Saw marks appeared near the wall where no later machine had erased them. A burn mark the size of a saucer remained by the hearth no matter how she sanded, and after a while she stopped trying. Some marks were not stains. They were testimony. By evening, her hands vibrated even when the sander was off. Her shoulders shook as she swept. Dust clung to the windows, the mantel, the stove lid, her eyelashes. She returned the sander at closing, walking the road with the cord looped around the handle and the machine heavy against her thigh. Mr. Whitcomb looked at her face and did not ask whether she had finished. The oiling took longer. Tung oil would have been best for water resistance. He said, but linseed was cheaper and already on a back shelf in a can dented near the bottom. They settled on a mixture for the first coat, thin enough to penetrate. Rubbed by hand with cloth, not poured. Ivy warmed the room, swept twice, wiped the boards with a barely damp rag, waited, then began near the far wall. The oil darkened the pine instantly, as if the floor had been thirsty for decades and ashamed to show it. Grain rose. Color deepened. The room changed again, not into something new, but into something that had been waiting beneath neglect. 3 coats, 48 hours between each, where the weather allowed curing. She slept in the mill workroom those nights on boards she trusted less, because the cottage floor needed to remain undisturbed. The first coat smelled nutty and sharp. The second gave the boards a low sheen. The third she applied on her knees with slow circular pressure. working the cloth until her palms ached and her back tightened. On the morning after the second coat, she could not rise. Could not in a dramatic way. Her body simply refused the next instruction. She had planned to buff the hearth edge, carry water, sort the remaining nails, and begin scraping the window sash. Instead, she sat on the bedroll with one boot in her hand and stared at the door until the light moved from gray to pale yellow. Outside, the air had softened just enough to make the snowcrust shine. She walked without tools toward the marshy lower ground beyond the race, where cattails stood broken and beige above the ice. A great blue heron lifted from the far edge as she approached, enormous and deliberate, its wings opening with a sound like cloth shaken once in a quiet room. It crossed the marsh low, legs trailing, then settled near the river bend and became still among the reeds. Ivy sat on a fallen log and watched it. The day passed without her improving anything. No nail was set. No board was rubbed. No account was updated. She ate cold beans from the tin cup, drank water that tasted faintly of smoke, and watched the heron move only when patience required it. Once it struck into the shallows and brought up something silver, quick and gone. The light changed. Clouds thickened. Her feet grew cold. Near evening, she returned to the cottage and did not punish herself by working after dark. She stirred the fire, hung her damp socks, and wrote one sentence in the notebook. Rest is not theft when the body is the only tool. She did not know if Elias would have agreed, but she thought he might have taken the pencil from her, considered it, and given it back without correction. By February, the windows had become the next honest argument. There were 8 in all between the cottage and the front of the mill, 3 with no glass, 4 cracked across 1 or more panes, and 1 original sash on the north side, dated by a penciled note on the rail to 1788, its wavy glass still holding the world in a slight trembling distortion. Ivy decided before asking anyone that she would not replace that one. Mr. Whitcomb agreed so quickly she suspected he had been prepared to argue if she chose otherwise. Old glass lies beautifully, he said. New glass only reports. The missing panes had been covered with boards, cardboard, and in one case a sheet of rusted tin nailed directly through the sash. Wind had used every gap. Snow had blown in, melted, and swollen the muntins. The cracked panes clicked faintly when the temperature changed. At night the cottage lost heat through them so steadily that Ivy could feel the cold flowing across the floor. Window work required smaller courage than roof work and more exact temper. She began by labeling each sash with pencil and paper tags tied through the cord holes. Front east upper. Front east lower. Cottage south 1. Mill room north fixed. Original north. Do not remove. The old sash cords had rotted into soft brown strands, and some counterweights lay hidden in the pockets like iron organs, no longer connected to breath. Mr. Whitcomb sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord from a spool, saying nylon had uses, but this was not one of them. Figure 8 knot at the counterweight, he said, demonstrating around 2 fingers. Not a granny knot, unless you want to hear failure inside the wall. She practiced the knot 5 times before cutting the first length. The glazing putty came in a squat can labeled DAP 33, the lid dented but tight. It was stiff from cold. Ivy kept the can near the hearth until the putty yielded under her thumb, then rolled it into ropes along the sash rabbet. First she removed the old points, rusted and stubborn, then eased broken glass out 1 triangle at a time. She wore gloves but still cut the side of her finger on a shard so fine she did not feel it until a red line appeared across the dust. The first replacement pane was not cut perfectly. She had measured the opening too tight, forgetting to leave the small mercy glass needs when wood swells. The pane caught at one corner and cracked with a sound that made her stand motionless for several seconds. Then she wrapped the pieces in newspaper, wrote "wasted" on the account page, and measured the next opening more carefully. 1/8 inch allowance. Dry fit. Points pressed gently. Putty knife at an angle. Smooth bevel. Not too proud, not too thin. The putty should shed water, not boast of itself. Amos came once and watched from the doorway. "Too much putty," he said. Ivy scraped half away. "Now too little." She looked at him. He almost smiled. "You are learning." The 3 empty windows took 2 days. The cracked ones took longer because cracked glass had to be persuaded without damaging what still held. She saved any unbroken old panes and moved them to the more visible sash, placing newer glass where weather mattered more than beauty. On the original 1788 window, she did almost nothing. She cleaned the frame with a dry brush, tightened one peg, and laid fresh putty only where the old had fully failed, leaving the wavy pane in place. When she looked through it, the walnut branches outside bent as though seen through water. It made the present less arrogant. The sash pockets were worse than the glass. She opened them carefully, removing trim with the narrow pry bar Mr. Whitcomb had added to her account after pretending not to notice she needed it. Inside, mouse nests filled 2 cavities. In another, an acorn cache poured out over her boot. The iron weights remained, cylindrical and cold, each tied once to a cord that had long since parted. Ivy cleaned the pockets, threaded new cotton cord over the pulley, tied the figure-8 knot at the counterweight, and tested the travel by lifting and lowering the sash until it moved without complaint. The first time a repaired window stayed open on its own, she laughed once. It startled her, the sound. It was small and rusty from disuse. She looked around the room as if someone else might have made it, then returned to the sash and lowered it gently. By the last week of February, light entered the cottage differently. Not warmer exactly, but cleaner. The front room no longer seemed to be looking through cataracts. In the mill room, sun reached the long work table and showed the grain beneath layers of dust. The North original still warped the view, preserving its own weathered truth. The repaired panes held against wind, and at night the candle flame stood straighter. The final window was the south cottage lower, the one beside the hearth where Ivy often sat to copy from the letter. Its lower rail had swollen, and she had to plane it by hand in thin curls that fell over her shoes. She set the glass, pressed the points, warmed the putty between her palms, and drew the knife along the bevel in one slow line. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch near the glass. It was so close she could see the black cap, the white cheek, the minute grip of its feet on the bark. The bird turned its head once, then again, bright-eyed and exact, inspecting the repaired window as if it had jurisdiction over such matters. Ivy held still with the putty knife in her hand. The chickadee gave one short note, no larger than a stitch, and flew toward the river. Ivy finished the bevel, cleaned the edge with a rag, and wrote the date in pencil along the inside rail where no one would see it unless they repaired the window again. February 27. South lower sash restored. The plaster failed most plainly after the windows stopped leaking. Before then, every weakness had been part of a larger dampness, one gray trouble among many. Once the sash held and the roof no longer admitted weather above the bedroll, the walls began to show their separate histories. Near the chimney, 3 patches had pulled away from the lath, bellied outward, and cracked in branching lines like dry creek beds. When Ivy pressed one with her fingertips, the surface shifted, and a spoonful of pale dust fell onto the newly oiled floor. The plaster was horsehair over hand-split oak lath, original in many places, repaired elsewhere by hands less patient than the first builders. Behind the broken patch, she could see the lath strips, each one riven rather than sawn, nailed with tiny irregular heads to the studs. The old plaster still held where the hair had bound it. In the failed places, water and chimney heat had worked together for years until the keys behind the lath broke and the wall forgot how to cling. Mr. Whitcomb had a bag of horsehair in his storage loft, not because people asked for it, but because his father had never thrown away a usable material. The bag had been tied sometime in the 1950s and labeled in pencil. Clean horsehire. Plaster. Keep DRY. The words made Ivy smile with only one corner of her mouth. Someone else had believed in future repair enough to keep even hair from a horse whose name no one remembered. The mix was not hurried. For the scratch coat, she used lime mortar worked with chopped horsehair. Enough hair that the plaster held together when pressed, but not so much it clumped on the trowel. She misted the lath first and waited for the wood to darken. Then she pushed the plaster through the gap so it mushroomed behind the strips, forming new keys. The manual said pressure mattered more than surface. Amos, who came by in his brown coveralls and watched her first attempt, said the same thing differently. Back of the wall first. So she pressed harder. The scratch coat went on rough, then was scored with horizontal lines using the notched edge of a broken comb she had found in the workroom. The scratches looked crude but honest, giving the next layer something to hold. She let it cure slowly, keeping the room from freezing and the surface from drying too quickly. The smell of lime joined wood smoke and linseed oil, sharp and mineral. The brown coat came next, 3/8 of an inch thick, built in measured patience. She checked the thickness with a marked scrap of wood and used a straight board to level the surface with the surrounding wall. 72 hours of cure followed. During that time, the patches darkened, lightened, and began to belong. The finish coat was thin, only 1/8 of an inch, lime-rich and smooth beneath the trowel. Ivy worked it in long upward motions, then feathered the edges with a damp brush until the repair did not vanish exactly, but settled into the wall without apology. New work did not need to pretend it was old. It needed to be faithful to what remained. When the final patch had taken its set, she stood in the cottage room as evening came through the repaired windows and rested one hand flat against the plaster near the chimney. "These patches will hold another 100 years," she said. No one answered. The wall held her palm. Doris Pike owned the Cold River Cafe and wore her hair in a braid wrapped twice around the back of her head, pinned with the same tortoise-shell comb every day except Sunday. She had a way of moving through her cafe that made haste unnecessary. Coffee cups filled before customers asked. Soup appeared when a man came in too cold to read the board. She wiped tables with circular strokes and kept a pencil behind her ear, though she could remember orders better than the pencil could. Her apron was always clean at opening and marked by flour, coffee, or gravy by noon. Ivy first noticed the paper bags on the porch before she understood where they came from. One morning there were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a jar of stewed apples, and a folded napkin. No note. Another morning, a heel of meatloaf, 3 boiled potatoes, and a small paper cup of butter. On the coldest day of late February, when the wind struck the cottage so hard the new window putty seemed to stiffen in answer, Ivy opened the door to find chicken soup in a lidded jar wrapped in a towel still holding warmth. She carried the empty jars back to the cafe after the 3rd delivery. Doris was behind the counter, cutting pie with a knife dipped in hot water. She did not look surprised to see her. "I need to pay you," Ivy said. Doris slid one slice onto a plate for a man in a green coat. No, you do not. I cannot keep taking food. You are not taking. I am leaving. That does not change the debt. Doris wiped the knife and finally looked up. Her eyes were gray, direct, and not given to argument for sport. Then pay me in candles when the shop reopens. Ivy stood with the jars in her hands. I do not make candles. You have beeswax in that place. I expect. Every shop like that had beeswax. Or you will learn. Or you will pay in paper. I am not particular about which future arrives. The man in the green coat lifted his coffee without looking at either of them, but his mouth moved as if he had nearly smiled. Doris took the jars, inspected them for chips, and set them beneath the counter. You eating enough? Yes. Mom. That is an answer, not proof. Ivy looked at the floorboards, clean and worn by many winter boots. More than before. Doris accepted the revision. Good. Bring the towel back when it dries. After that, the paper bags did not stop, though they came less often, and never with enough ceremony to embarrass either woman. Doris left food the way some people left kindling, near the door, where the need was plain and the receiver could bring it in privately. Caleb Whitcomb entered Ivy's winter by way of noise. The sound came from the track one Saturday afternoon. A squeal of brakes, a clatter, then a muttered word cut short in the presence of the building. Ivy looked out the cottage window and saw a boy standing beside a red Schwinn bicycle with chrome fenders and a milk crate wired to the back. He wore a canvas jacket too large in the shoulders and a knit cap pulled low. An axe handle stuck out of the crate, along with a lunch pail and a folded burlap sack. He was the boy who had brought the ladder from the hardware shed. My father sent me, he said when she opened the door. Mr. Whitcomb? He said you had rounds that need splitting. I did not ask him. My mother said. About your grandfather. The sentence arrived in pieces, as if he had been instructed to deliver it but not to decorate it. His ears were red from the ride. Snow clung to his cuffs. He looked past Ivy toward the stacked wood beneath the lean-to, then at the axe in his crate. He was not my grandfather, Ivy said gently. Caleb shrugged. Mothers use the word they mean. That seemed too old a remark for him, and he appeared uncomfortable after saying it. He pulled the splitting maul from the crate before she could decide whether to invite him in. The maul was nearly as tall as the bicycle frame, its head scarred and blackened, its handle polished where hands had held it. Caleb worked without flourish. He set each round on the chopping block, studied the grain, lifted, and let the maul fall with a precision that did not waste much strength. When a piece split cleanly, he stacked it bark side up beneath the overhang. When one resisted, he turned it, found the check, and struck again. Ivy worked nearby, carrying the split wood inside and sweeping chips from the path. After an hour, she brought out water. Caleb drank from the tin cup, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and said, Do not pay me. I was going to offer beans. He considered that. Beans are not pay. Beans are food. So you will take them? If there is... She packed a jar of beans for him with a pinch of salt folded in paper. He accepted it as if the terms had been carefully negotiated. Before leaving, he looked at the mill sign above the main door. Are you going to fix the words? Eventually. He nodded. Needs fixing. Then he rode back toward town, the empty crate rattling behind him and the axe handle tied across the frame with twine. Reverend Boyd did not enter the property at all that winter. He walked past every morning on Cold River Road, a tall man in a black coat gone green at the seams. with a brimmed hat and a silver beard trimmed close to the jaw. The church near the cemetery was his, though Ivy had never attended. She knew his name because Mrs. Armitage said it once while explaining which hall might open during weather. He walked at the same hour whether sky threatened snow or the road shone with ice. His gait was measured, aided by a cane made from some dark crooked branch. At first, he only tipped his hat when he passed the broken mailbox post. Ivy saw him from the window, a slim black figure beyond the walnut trees, pausing just long enough to acknowledge the property without inspecting it. Later, when she was carrying water from the river, he stopped at the road and lifted his hat properly. "Morning," he called. "Morning, sir." He looked at the roof, then at the smoke rising from the chimney. "Holding," for now is honest. He did not come closer. He did not ask whether she had family, whether she needed church, whether she understood salvation, shelter, or any of the other large words people sometimes offered when small help would do. He set his hat back on his head. "Lord, keep her steady." 4 words. Then he continued down the road. He said the same thing most mornings after that, sometimes aloud, sometimes only with the movement of his lips and the tip of his hat when the wind was too hard for speech. Ivy did not know what she believed about prayers carried past a condemned mill by an elderly man with a crooked cane. She only knew that, after a while, she watched for him. On days when snow covered the track before dawn, his footprints appeared first along the road. They made the town feel nearer. The cellar had been postponed until February 11 because Ivy did not like what she could not see. That was the practical reason. There were others below it. The cottage floor had required attention. The chimney had been urgent. The roof had deserved every dry hour. Yet she knew, each time she passed the low door beneath the stairs, that she was also delaying the descent because some hidden places ask more from a person than labor. The Hollander had given up one sealed place. She was not eager to demand another. The cellar door opened inward on leather hinges stiffened almost to stone. She had to work them with oil, patience, and a careful lift before they agreed to move. Cold came up at once. Deeper than the room's cold, with a smell of fieldstone, earth, old roots, and potatoes long gone. She set the lantern on the floor, tied one end of the clothesline to the stair post because the manual suggested caution in any uninspected cellar, and tested the first step. Granite. There were 7 steps down, each one a single slab, worn in the middle by feet from years when people carried crocks. Ash buckets, apples, preserves, and perhaps grief up and down without naming the act. The walls below were fieldstone, laid dry in some places, mortared in others, patched by different hands across generations. The floor measured roughly 12 by 15 feet, stone-packed and uneven, with a central drain channel leading toward the riverside. She descended slowly, lantern held low. The cellar was not large, but it held the dense seriousness of useful underground rooms. Along the far wall stood 3 empty shelves. One collapsed. A row of stoneware crocks sat beneath them, their lids missing. Hooks hung from the beam overhead. A rusted barrel hoop leaned in a corner. Near the foundation line under the chimney, white efflorescence bloomed over the stone like mineral frost. At the center of the floor lay a single-dressed granite slab, unlike the rougher stones around it. It was rectangular, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, fitted so precisely into the fieldstone that its edges made a clean outline. In the center had been carved the water wheel and paper mark, shallow but unmistakable, its lines filled with dust. Ivy crouched beside it and brushed the carving with her fingertips. A slab like that invited lifting. She did not lift it. Not because she lacked curiosity. Because curiosity, untethered, could become the same hunger that had emptied Elias's workshop. The slab was too heavy to move safely alone, and its purpose was not yet clear. She sketched it in the notebook, measured it with a length of cord, and wrote, center slab, dressed granite, craft mark, leave untouched. Then she inspected the walls, the sill above, the stair stringers, and the underside of the floor she had worked so hard to secure. Practical matters first. 2 stones near the east corner needed resetting in spring. 1 shelf could be salvaged. The drain needed clearing before thaw. No standing water. No fresh animal damage except mice. She was coming back up when the lantern light caught an unnatural line beneath the 3rd step. At first it seemed like shadow where the granite overhung. Then she saw wood grain. A small oak box had been wedged under the stair from the back. Invisible when descending, visible only when coming up with light held low. It was no larger than a Bible, darkened by dust and fitted so tightly she had to work it loose with both hands. The lid had swollen shut. She carried it upstairs before opening it, unwilling to force old wood in cellar damp. On the cottage table, in late afternoon light, the box yielded to the narrow knife and a gentle twist. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph. The key was long, heavier than any door key she knew, with a bow shaped like the heritage mark, the water wheel crossing a sheet of paper. Its bit was complicated, cut with notches that suggested a lock made by someone who had expected to be remembered or not found at all. Time had darkened the brass, but where Ivy rubbed it with a rag, gold showed through. The photograph was wrapped in a piece of linen. She lifted it carefully. The image had tarnished at the edges, but the central figure remained clear, a young woman standing in front of this cottage when the porch posts were straight and the windows newly painted. She wore a dark skirt, a pale blouse, and an apron. In her right hand she held a mold and decal. Her hair was pinned high, but loose strands had escaped at her temples. Her face was narrow at the chin, serious around the mouth, and so startlingly familiar that Ivy put the photograph down. Not identical. No one was identical across a century. Yet the arrangement of the eyes, the line of the cheek, the guarded set of the mouth before a camera's demand for stillness, all of it came close enough to make the room seem briefly without time. She turned the tintype over. On the back, in ink faded brown, someone had written Anna Merriwether Hale, daughter of Elspeth Merriwether Hale, age 25, summer of 1903. Ivy read the line twice before the date struck against the letter. The Anna in the photograph could not be the child buried in 1892 unless the letter had concealed a grief more complicated than its sentence allowed. Or perhaps there had been 2 Annas. One lost, one named in memory. Families repeated names when love did not know where else to go. She did not solve it. Not that day. She wrapped the photograph again and placed it between boards beside the letter, then set the brass key on the mantel beneath the metal case. In the firelight, the key shone dully, its bow casting a small round shadow like a wheel. It did not fit the cottage door. The mill door, the cedar chest, the tin box, or any drawer she could find. For now, it kept its own counsel. Spring did not arrive as kindness first. It came as mud. The snow retreated from the clearing in a slow, untidy withdrawal, leaving behind flattened grass, black walnut husks, broken twigs, and every nail Ivy had dropped since December. The track became soft by noon and froze again at night, ridging under her boots. The creek and river grew loud with snowmelt, no longer speaking in winter's narrow voice but rushing broad and brown against the stones. The mill race filled in sections where debris did not block it, and water began to test the old channel with a memory older than Ivy's ownership. Walnut catkins appeared like small green-brown tassels against the dark branches. The chickadees came more often. A red-winged blackbird called from the marsh on a morning when the air smelled of thawed earth and wet bark. Ivy stood near the raceway with a rake and listened until the call repeated, sharp and living over the mud. The work did not end because weather softened. It changed. She cleared the drain in the cellar before the first heavy rain. She opened the mill doors on dry afternoons to air the room, then closed them before evening damp settled. She sorted the felts, saving what could be washed and cutting ruined edges into smaller pressing cloths. She catalogued the molds by size and condition. She cleaned the long table with warm water, mild soap, and patience, never soaking the wood, never scraping away marks that belonged there. She turned the Hollander's external wheel 1 inch after oiling the bearing for 2 weeks, then stopped because 1 inch was enough knowledge for spring. She decided not to begin the craft that season. The choice surprised Mr. Whitcomb, though he tried to hide it by rearranging a display of seed packets. "Thought you would be making paper soon," he said. "So did I. And I would be doing it to prove something." He nodded as if that answer had walked farther than she knew.
Bad reason to start a machine.
She would order materials slowly. She would spend 1 coin if she needed to. Not a bill. And record it. She would practice first in a basin with a hand mold, with cotton linter, linen scraps, and water warmed on the stove. She would make poor sheets before asking the old equipment to remember. She would learn the drag on the wrist, the weight of a proper pulp, the difference between a sheet that held and a sheet that merely looked whole while wet. By April, the cottage held a dry corner for sleeping, a shelf for food, a box for kindling, and a table by the south window where she could write with daylight on her left hand. The medal remained on the mantel. The brass key remained beside it. The letter and photographs stayed flat between boards. The money stayed hidden again, not in the beater, but in a place she could reach if need became honest. One afternoon, after rain had rinsed the roof clean and left the air smelling of moss and thawed stone, Ivy sat on the porch step and watched water run through the lower race in a bright, broken ribbon. Her hands rested open on her skirt. They were no longer soft in any place. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ivy made the first sheet that did not ask her forgiveness. Snow had begun before breakfast, soft flakes drifting through the walnut branches and settling on the repaired porch rail. The cottage was warm enough that the windows clouded at the lower corners. In the workroom, the long table had been scrubbed, leveled, and waxed. The repaired drying rack stood near the south wall. Clean felts hung from a line above the stove. A small modern basin sat beside the old vat, not replacing it, only serving as a modest beginning while the larger equipment waited its full turn. She had spent nearly 2 years practicing in humble batches. Cotton first, because it was forgiving. Then linen. Then blends. She had ruined more sheets than she kept. Some tore at the couching. Some dried with hard ridges. Some cockled because she pressed too soon or changed boards too late. Some looked fine until held to light, where clumps showed her every impatient stir. She saved the failures in a labeled box. Bad sheets. Use for notes. Waste became instruction when a person could bear to look at it. That December morning, the vat held linen and cotton beaten to the right softness, with 1 blue thread, 1 brown thread, and 1 white thread cut so fine they seemed almost like thought in the water. She stirred from the bottom, dipped the mold nose first, leveled her wrists, lifted in one motion, and shook once left to right, once toward herself. Then stillness. Water drained in a silver veil. The fibers settled evenly across the screen. She couched the sheet onto damp felt, rolled her hands forward, and lifted the mold without a tear. 12 hours under pressure. A change to dry boards. Wait. Waiting. The next day, when she lifted the corner, the sheet held. Thin, not perfect, faintly clouded in one margin, but alive. She set it on the table and held it toward the winter light. The blue thread rested near one corner. The brown was visible only when the paper turned. The white disappeared unless she knew where to look. That seemed right. By then, the restored interior had not become grand. It had become usable, which was a higher praise. The cottage room held a narrow iron bed bought second-hand from a barn sale and painted by hand in soft black. The white pine floor had darkened under oil and winter footsteps. The hearth drew cleanly. A braided rug from Doris lay near the stove, though Doris insisted it was not a gift, only something her cousin had been tired of owning. The plaster patches had cured to a gentle lime color, slightly different from the older wall, as visible as mended cloth. The south window opened and closed without complaint. In the mill room, tools hung where labels could find them. Awls. Brushes. Knives. Thread. Needles. Mold repair. A shelf held jars of starch, borate, alum, cedar oil, clove, and wheat paste made in small batches. The Hollander beater had not yet been fully returned to service, but its compartment remained empty and clean, and its iron had been oiled enough to lose the look of abandonment. The long belt still hung above it, waiting for a repair Ivy would not rush. A modest hand beater stood beside the vat, built with Caleb's help from salvage maple, a crank, and stubborn trial. The brass key remained on the mantel for 2 winters before it found its lock. The finding came after an ice storm in early January, when a limb split from the walnut nearest the race and fell without striking the cottage, though it landed close enough to shake snow from the porch roof. Ivy went out with a saw after the weather cleared. The horseshoe in the trunk had become more exposed where bark tore away near the scar. While clearing broken branches, she noticed a brass plate set into the wood on the far side, hidden for years beneath lichen, bark growth, and the angle of the slope. It was no larger than her palm, green-black with age, with a keyhole nearly sealed by dirt. She stood looking at it for a long minute while the river moved below.
Then she went inside and brought the key.
The bit entered reluctantly. She did not force it. She cleaned the hole with a pine needle, warmed the key in her hand, and tried again. This time it seated fully. When she turned it, something inside the tree released with a small metallic click. A narrow door opened in the trunk. Not deep. Not large. A chamber had been made within an old scar long before the tree closed around its edges, lined in tin and sealed behind the brass plate. Inside lay a folded flag wrapped in oilcloth and a note in a small tin tube. Ivy carried both to the cottage before opening them, because some objects deserved shelter before revelation. The flag had 48 stars. It was folded into a tight triangle, the fabric aged but sound. The red dulled toward brick, the white toward cream.
A paper tag tucked into one fold read S.
Hale, returned 1919. The note in the tube was dated November 11, 1919. The handwriting was Elspeth's, steadier than in the later letter. Samuel came home by train in a government box, and the flag came with him. They told me the war had ended 1 year ago today, and that I should be comforted by victory. I am not comforted by words that leave a chair empty. Still, I will keep this flag dry because it covered him, and because someday a hand less angry than mine may know how to honor what I can only carry. If you find it, do not wave it for display. Fold it again. Remember that cloth can hold a country's promise and a household's wound at the same time. Ivy read the note standing by the table, the flag resting on clean linen before her. Outside, thaw water clicked from the eaves, though morning remained below freezing. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough for the fire to settle. Long enough for the first shock of discovery to become instruction. She folded the flag again along its established lines and returned it to oilcloth. Not to the tree, but to a cedar box on the mantel beneath the metal. The brass plate she closed and locked, leaving the chamber empty. Some hiding places, once they have done their work, may be allowed to rest. The metal traveled in Ivy's coat pocket on November 11th, 2024. She did not take it far, only to the old cemetery past the village, and then, with Reverend Boyd's directions written on a card, to the section where veterans from the town had been named on a modest granite marker. The anniversary morning was cold and clear. Frost silvered the grass. A small flag stood beside several stones, its cloth stiff from the night air. She had cleaned the metal case with a dry brush and a soft cloth, not enough to make it shine, only enough to remove dust. No ceremony had been announced. No crowd gathered. Reverend Boyd came because he walked that way, or said he did. Mrs. Armitage came with a scarf pinned under her chin. Mr. Whitcomb stood with both hands in his coat pockets, and Doris brought coffee in a thermos without asking who wanted it. Caleb, taller now, arrived late on the red Schwinn, though his knees had begun to look ridiculous above the frame. Ivy set the metal on the stone for 1 minute. Then she picked it up and brought it home. Honor did not require surrender. The money remained mostly unspent. That surprised people only if they imagined hidden money as escape. Ivy had not found escape. She had found responsibility with enough breathing room inside it to survive. 3 coins had been sold through a careful dealer recommended by Mrs. Armitage's cousin, each documented, photographed, weighed, and recorded in the ledger. 1 Morgan dollar paid for the first winter's property insurance premium when no company wanted the risk without an inspection. 1 half eagle became roofing, chimney, and window materials after the account at Whitcomb's grew beyond neighborly courage. 1 worn gold coin paid the back taxes and a legal consultation to make the deed, boundaries, and occupancy path honest. A 4th coin was nearly spent during the second winter when the hand pump failed, but Mr. Whitcomb found a rebuild kit in a supplier's warehouse, and Caleb helped pull the pipe before the ground froze. Ivy kept the coin and wrote almost spent beside it in the ledger. The rest returned to the tin box, wrapped differently now, catalogued by date, photograph, and condition. She sealed it not in secrecy, but in stewardship, with a page on top written in her own hand. For the next one, if need is honest, she did not call the place a business at first. Doris did that for her by pinning a cream index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for firewood and a lost gray cat named Mabel. The card was written in Ivy's hand because Doris had insisted the letters needed to look like the product. Merriwether handmade paper, small batches, repair sheets, paste for bookwork, inquiries by mail or cafe message. No phone number appeared. No website. No promise of quick orders. Doris said scarcity made people behave better, but Ivy suspected Doris simply enjoyed being the town's unofficial switchboard. The first inquiries were modest. A woman wanted paper for wedding vows because her grandmother had once kept a Merriwether receipt. A church needed repair sheets for a pulpit Bible damaged by a roof leak. Larkspur used books asked whether Ivy could make paste suitable for rebacking a set of county histories. Mrs. Armitage needed a page repaired in a town ledger and pretended the county required an estimate, though both women knew she had already decided. By the end of that winter, the mailing list held 43 names. Ivy kept them in a small box by the south window, each name on a separate card. She answered slowly. Sometimes she refused work because the request needed a conservator with equipment she did not have. Sometimes she sent instructions instead of invoices. Sometimes she accepted payment in cash. Sometimes in barter. Sometimes in patience. No order left without a small note describing the fiber, the drying time, and the care required. The notes took almost as long as the wrapping. She considered that part of the work. Caleb returned with the sign in April. He was 17 by then, taller, quieter, and trying to decide whether to become the kind of young man who left, or the kind who stayed long enough to make leaving a choice rather than a reflex. The red Schwinn had finally been replaced by an old pickup with one blue door and one white door. He drove up the track on a Saturday afternoon with a wooden sign wrapped in a quilt across the truck bed. "I made a thing," he said. Ivy came out wiping paste from her fingers. The sign was carved from a single plank of walnut, oiled until the grain moved like dark water. The letters were hand-cut, not perfect, but deliberate. He had copied the old sign's curve without imitating its decay. At the top, smaller, was the water wheel and paper mark. Beneath it, in deep, clean letters, he had carved, "Merriwether and Daughters, handmade papers in repair." Ivy read it once. Then again. "There were not daughters," Caleb said quickly, mistaking her stillness. "I mean, there were, but I meant not one daughter. More like all of them. I can plane it off if it is wrong." She touched the carved ampersand. It had taken him time. More than he would admit. "Do not plane it off. My mother said plural was. Your mother is often. She says that too." The old sign above the mill door had not fallen, but it had become too fragile to ask another season from it. They took it down carefully, Ivy on the ladder and Caleb below, both of them working the rusted chain loose link by link. Behind the sign, the clapboards were darker, sheltered from weather by the words that had hung there for generations. The new sign went up on 2 black iron brackets, Mr. Whitcomb had found in the hardware cellar. Amos came to supervise, though he pretended to be passing by. Doris stood at the road with her arms folded. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat from beside the broken mailbox post. Mrs. Armitage arrived with a folder under one arm, which turned out to contain no official papers at all, only a photograph she had found in an archive showing the mill in 1910 with drying sheets in the yard. When the sign settled into place, it did not transform the building. The roof still showed repair. The clapboard still needed scraping in several seasons. The water wheel remained under restoration, half-shadowed and patient. But the new words held against the weather without shame. Daughters, plural. Ivy did not ask who counted. The sign already knew. That night, she began her own letter. Not because she was ill. Not because she expected to disappear soon. Because the earlier letter had taught her that inheritance written only at the edge of death carries too much burden. A living hand could leave instructions without the pressure of farewell. A living hand could admit ignorance, debt, failure, and gratitude while there was still time to correct the recipe. She chose a sheet from the December batch, the first one that had held. It was not flawless, one edge feathered more than she liked. A faint cloud gathered near the lower right corner where the pulp had settled unevenly. She kept it for the letter because perfection seemed a poor vessel for truth. At the table by the south window, she set out the bone folder, the copied paste recipe, the ledger of spent coins, the list of names, and the tintype photograph. The brass key rested on the mantel again. Its work done for now. The medal and flag lay protected in cedar. Outside, the river ran high with spring water, and the walnut branches held the first green smoke of leaf. She dipped the pen. For a long time, she wrote nothing. Then she began with the only opening that fit. My dear one, whoever you are. She paused after the period and listened to the room. The cottage gave its ordinary sounds. Fire settling. Window sash ticking in evening cool. A mouse somewhere beyond the wall, still unconvinced by all human claims to ownership. In the mill room, the hand molds hung on their pegs. The drying racks waited. The repaired table held tomorrow's work beneath clean cloth. Ivy wrote about what she had found and what she had not yet understood. She wrote down the roof materials, the chimney mix, the plaster coats, the sash cord knots, the name of the insurance agent who had finally accepted the inspection, the dealer who had treated the coins with respect, and the warning not to lift the granite slab alone. She wrote that the Hollander still needed a belt and proper bearing inspection before any full run. She wrote that the old formulas were sound, but hands must still learn them slowly. She did not write about Preston. She did not write about the hallway. She did not write about the paper she had once signed. Some stories lose power when they are carried into every room. Some are best left outside, not denied, not avenged, simply not allowed to become the foundation. Instead, she wrote the names of those who had helped the house stand. Helen Armitage, Nathaniel Whitcomb, Doris Pike, Caleb Whitcomb, Reverend Boyd, Amos Pike, the librarian in Keene whose name she had later learned by writing a thank-you note through the library desk, the woman at the gas station, the feed driver with the collie, Elias Reed, who had taught a girl that the page was stronger than hurry. She wrote until the candle burned low. Then she sanded the wet ink with a pinch of fine pounce from an old jar, waited, and folded nothing. This letter would not be sealed yet. It would grow while she did. It would remain in the ledger drawer where it could be corrected, added to, contradicted by better knowledge. A letter for the next inheritor did not need to be finished in one night. Years later, perhaps someone would find it. Perhaps not. Outside, the mill race carried water past stones cleared by hand. The wheel had not yet turned under full load, but its buckets were repaired, its bands tightened, its axle greased against the day when water and wood would remember one another. In the cottage, the south window reflected a woman seated at a table, older than she had been and still young enough to learn more than she knew. The mill was not empty. It had been waiting. A paper mill waits. It has always waited. It waits in fiber soaking beneath water, in linen surrendering thread by thread, in a mold lifted level by wrists that have learned humility. It waits in ledgers kept exact, in windows that hold against wind, in plaster that grips unseen behind the wall. It waits in the difference between hiding and keeping, between possession and care, between a thing abandoned and a thing not yet reclaimed. It had waited through cheap contracts, closed doors, silent decades, snow through the roof, raccoon nests, tax notices, and the county's red demolition stamp. It had waited through a young woman's long walk, through her first poor fire, through soot, lime, oil, hunger, and the discovery of money that did not become escape because she had learned how quickly careless rescue can become another form of loss. And in a shallow drawer in Mrs. Armitage's desk, beneath a stack of receipt books and a rubber band gone brittle with age, the original folded dollar remained. The clerk had not placed it in the cash box that day. She had meant to move it later, then did not.